called themselves beatniks. It means rejection of tradition. So the movement began in San Francisco and drew wide attention from the verse poem of Allen Ginsberg Howe. So this loosely knit group of poets or American writers become exiles within their old culture with a bohemian reaction against the so-called silent generation of 1950s. They had marked influence on contemporary American literature and the youth movement of the 1960s also. The beat writers rejected conventional consumer society and created their literature and unconventional lifestyle of like Zen Buddhism, drags, jazz, and hate and respect for the individual over the mass. So it is the most free speech movement in American literature. So there are many writers in the beat movement, but Allen Ginsberg, Jack Kerouac, and William Burroughs, these are the prominent writers from beat generation. Even their works are the landmarks like Howl by Allen Ginsberg, Jack Kerouac's On the Road, and William Burroughs at the Naked Lunch. So the impact of the beat generation was significant on American literature. And it was because of beat generation, the people began to question the society they lived in and stepped out of it. So the beat generation also set precedent for many important things such as hippies and even anti-war movement. So that influence can be seen on the hippie movement of 1960s and 70s. And some of the most long-lasting effects we have today from the beat generation include the revolution of music industry. Even the music industry is quite much influenced by the beat writers, particularly a famous poet or writer or the Nobel Prize winner, Bob Dylan. So they created a new freestyle in music, even both lyrically and melodically. So the beat writers, they dig meaning along with everything from drugs to sexual relationship. The beat generation of the 1940s and 50s gave way to love generation and young generation. So their social philosophy was the same, living in the present, unconventionally seeking personal freedom, and claiming to be acting against red race, and associating themselves from politics, taking superficial interest in religion of the East. So these are the common or such characteristics of beat generation. But if we see beat generation as an avant-garde movement in American literature, so avant-garde terms refer to works and people that are experimental. The term is used for the movements in art and literature during the end and beginning years of 20th century. And avant-garde writers and artists reject mainstreams and even conventions, mainstream culture and conventions. So the writers frequently represented themselves alienated from the society. So prominent aim of avant-garde movement was to shock the sensibilities of the conventional writers and even to challenge the regular norms. So the beat movement has same qualities like avant-garde movement. Beat writers created a new kind of literature with various experiments. Beat generation writers have not only rejected the earlier tradition of writing literature, but changed the very perception of aesthetics. They blurred the boundary between what is beautiful and what is considered as ugly. For example, in the works of beat writers, in none the texts discuss lines and paragraphs that can be tested with the same tools of earlier literature. Even the subject of sex, as it is naked, as it is wild and sexual, is presented, which is otherwise is covered under the quilt of lovemaking. Taking drugs is seen as sinful activity or Taking drugs is not seen as an activity or a social behavior, but given the title of individualistic license to do so. So in this regard, it is big rejection to the earlier tradition of idealistic art. They created new style of writing or new way of writing. Just take an example of Howl poem, which is the main work in Beat Generation. So in this poem, the writer Allen Ginsberg did not follow any rule. He experiments with new style. Jack Kerouac has written his novel On the Road. So the novel is written in scroll type and there is no paragraph. Even the work of William Burroughs, Naked Lunch, it is divided into different chapters, or what he called it, vignettes. But one can read from anywhere. Following chronology is not required when you read the novel Naked Lunch. Even they experiment with drugs. So most of the beat writers were drug addicts. They thought it enhances creativity. These poets and writers have written what they lived, and that is why experimentation of drug is bound to appear in their works. Now, liberty, if you see libertine sexualities in the works of beat writers, they openly wrote about sexualities. So beat writers are also famous or infamous for their open sexual relationships. Ginsberg and William Burroughs and other writers, they openly confessed that they were homosexuals. So their sexuality was not something they wanted to hide, but to celebrate them. So Beat Generation writers openly wrote about sex and homosexuality. Some of them openly confessed that they are homosexual or bisexuals. So as like avant-garde writers, Beat writers also rejected the unconventional standards, not only rejected, but condemned straightway. So beat writers were contrary to other conventional writers. They created new style of writing along with way of living, not thinking about what people would say about them. Just we take example of Howl as an experimental poem. Howl is a bold attempt to assert the new paths into poetry writing in American poetic tradition. It starts with the magnificent line, like, I saw the best minds of my generation, starving, hysterical, naked. So in these lines, or in this line, poet speaks on behalf of young generation in America who does not follow the conventions. The best minds are referred as naked. So naked also means that society persecutes you. Being naked is a kind of protest also. Poet also tries to write about people who have best minds, but post-war period turns them mad, hysterical, and destroyed them finally. Even one key characteristic of Beat Generation is rejection of materialism and clear-cut portrayals of human condition. So Beat Generation writers were against the materialism. For example, the second part of Allen Ginsberg poem Howl, which is on Moloch. Whereas Jack Kerouac gives a description of lifelike characters in the work On the Road. So they do not believe in romantic notion, how they would like people to be, but present characters as they are. Now, important role of city light books. Maybe in the history, it may be the first time a bookstore played an important role in particular movement. City light books, which is in San Francisco by Lawrence Ferlinghetti. So both the store and publisher became widely known following the obscenity trial of Ferlinghetti for publishing the work of Allen Ginsberg, Howl, and other poems. So it is recognized as a bookstore and a landmark that attracts thousands of book lovers from all over the world and a site of supporting alternative culture and arts. Beat Generation opens up a new horizon in American literature. The works are potentially capable of preserving and passing on the links between latent American and manifest American culture. They showcase the length and breadth of civilization maturity of American life, wherein new drug, hang out with friends, sexual perversion, have become roots of aesthetic pursuits. So the way Beat Generation speaks highly about the kind of Americans were living in the post-war II society. The works of Beat Generation writers are manifesto of an extreme individualistic society that is influencing other societies of the world. So Beats actually propelled a new wave in American culture, the America that we know today, quite different from the America before and after the Beat movement of 1940s and 50s. So people called them obscene, but in reality, they were direct and forthright in their views and opinions. Okay, my time is over. Thank you, sir.
Thank you so much, Amin. Professor Broncano, can I interrupt in between, because your way of telling the time is quite impressive, like the 2 minutes and the 1 minute left, really impressive. Thank you so much, sir. But in between, I just want to talk to Shruti Gaur. Shruti, can you hear us, or will you say something so that we can check your sound system? Unmute yourself first. Shruti.
I was muted, I'm sorry.
Yes, ma'am, I've unmuted myself. Can you all hear me?
Yes, your technical glitch is all over now. Over to
Oh,
Prof.
thank
Thank you so much, sir. Thank you, sir.
And my apologies. I mean, I just said that you did perfectly well. You were right on time, so thank you very much. And I guess that we'll, if you don't mind, we'll leave questions for the end of the presentation so that we can have some kind of conversation.
Thank you, sir.
About all of them. Okay, so thank you. Our next presenter is Professor Lal Tlankimi. Sorry if I don't get it wrong. Paper titled The Beat Movement and the American Model of Freedom and Resistance. So the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, sir. Can everyone hear me? All right. Okay. Thank you, sir. So my name is Efla Tlankimi, and everyone was right on the pronunciation of my name. I'm an assistant professor at the Government Zolnam College, and I'm also a PhD research scholar at Mizoram University. So my topic today is also on the Beat generation, and it's entitled The Beat Movement and the American Model of Freedom and Resistance. So I'll not be talking about so much so the literature of the movement, rather the impact on culture and the society of American living. So the Beat Generation movement was a uniquely American, an American movement, because it helps to define the text, help to define post-World War II American culture, and they continue to inspire readers to search for meaning and adventure. So the significance of the movement lies in the fact that the ideals and the lifestyles, the attitude is still being emulated and celebrated in the contemporary context. So that's that the significance of the movement lies in that. And what is firstly recognized in the literature and lifestyle of the Beat writers is the notion of nonconformity and the desire to be free from the dictates and restraints of societal conventions. So these notions, these ideas were very much shared by the generation of the post-World War society, and later that evolved into the culture uprising and counterculture movement of the 1960s, which was an international movement. And like any other culture movement that has this amount of impact, among the general masses, it was picked up by the mainstream culture and being articulated into for mass consumption. So the movement, the sentiments of the movement, the ideas of the movement have undergone so much changes within the movement of the counterculture and also other movements that followed. And so, although the the original ideals of the Beat movement can still be seen today, the changes, I think, becomes very important, and it is I think what marks the Beat movement to be separate from other movements of American culture and literature. So the American society that the Beat movement was born out of was comprised of economic growth, booming industry, and livelihoods that was made much more comfortable and much more easier than ever before due to the availability of technological advancements and household appliances. Now, although this newly achieved means of living was ideal for many, it did not reach everyone. It did not appeal to the mass audiences, which led to the loss of culture identity and self meaning. And after the Beat movement came forward with their notion of freedom, it was the livelihood, the morals, and the practices of the American middle class, the affluent middle class, was questioned. And they recognized a lack of freedom within the communities that was driven by the capitalist industry, its reliance on consumerism, preoccupation with materialism, and the support of militarism. So recognizing that the whole of society was stifled in a way of life that had little room for free and individual expression, the primary purpose of the Beat movement was to challenge this notion of American life and exploring other forms of existence that the society did not offer to them. So the movement can largely be seen as countering the idea of the American dream, which stood for the general conception that any individual, irrespective of their background or class, can achieve their idea of success if they work hard enough. So essentially, that had everything to do with the traditional way of life, such as the nuclear family, celibacy before marriage, support of militarism, among other things. Those are the things that were being rejected by members of the movement. And by distancing themselves from the conservative capitalist ideals of the middle class American communities, they sought to push the boundaries of convention. And in doing so, they created an environment for themselves that was overflowing with acceptance and individual freedom of expression. So elements of their writing and lifestyle, as I have mentioned, was incorporated into the counterculture narratives of the 1960s. And with the birth of the hippie culture and the popularization of bohemian culture, the use of drugs, promiscuity, and avant-garde means of artistic expression were being popularized by a generation of the youth who shared the sentiment of being disillusioned and alienated by the principles of their parent generation. And with culture icons such as the Beatles, Bob Dylan, as we've heard, Janis Joplin, the Rolling Stones, popularizing psychedelic rock and innovative and experimental art into the limelight, the idols of rebellion became more and more recognized and practiced in popular culture scene. So by the mid 1960s, what had made up the avant-garde culture of the Beats had largely been incorporated into the practices of the general masses. So while rebelling against the hegemonic rule of Western capitalism, it had become the case that at the height of the 1960s counterculture, a large part of the mainstream capitalist industry was being benefited from the avant-garde culture that was previously known to be the subculture. As Ernesto Lacau has explained, how rebellious tendencies can be transformed within particular culture settings. And I'll be quoting a little bit from him here. A class is hegemonic not so much to the extent that it is able to impose a uniform conception of the world to the rest of the society, but to the extent that it can articulate different visions of the world in such a way that their potential antagonism is neutralized. So within the ambit of the counterculture of the 1960s, it has become the case that the counterculture narrative that was propounded by the Beats had become a dominant form of culture expression, with its popularization reaching its height. So although this hegemonic rule may have been acknowledged as an achievement by the youth generation, the fact that the popularization of this protest culture by means of music, fashion, and art, etc., it was being articulated in the economic interest of the capitalist industry. So the problem here was that while the counterculture was gaining momentum, the idols of the Beat generation was gaining momentum, it was being articulated and benefiting the capitalist industry, which was being protested against in the first place. So with this, the counterculture was declining slowly, and with the further politicization of the movement, ultimately led to the end of the counterculture that was in the decade that followed. So although it was short-lived, the idols that was propounded by the Beats was it was really celebrated within the counterculture, which gave rise to its popularization even today. And it was not particularly at the beginning, the Beat movement was not particularly politically motivated. However, with the politicization of the counterculture narratives, which the beat writers had influenced, it became the case that the art became secondary to the political propaganda. And what distinguished the beat movement was that firstly, the art was celebrated, and the political undertone came second to this. Regardless of their political stance, the beat literature was known and celebrated firstly as an art form, though through which its authors expressed themselves. So the same, however, cannot be said for the social movements that followed. As political propaganda is what drives the popular forms of art and entertainment, and then the artistic element becomes second. So in other words, activism through art and entertainment has been transformed into a tool through which propaganda is being force fed to the audiences. So the difference between the beats and the social movements that follow can further be witnessed in the violent dissents that commonly occur in the counterculture movement of the 1960s, and also protest narratives and other social movements that we see today. So the tendency to resort to violence was a dominant part of the 1960s counterculture, as well as the protests of the present era. And these outbursts of violence and hatred for ideas in people of the opposite political spectrum, it's what is one of the most prominent aspects that can differentiate the movement of the Beats and their successors. So it is also noteworthy that prominent figures of the Beat generation, like Allen Ginsberg and Jack Kerouac, were known to, call out the liberal movements, the liberal left-wing American protests and their violent tendencies when they saw that it was not in par with their goal at the beginning, as the beat literature has always been known to celebrate peace and diversity and peaceful coexistence. So they were not afraid to call this out. And Ginsberg has also stated his worries over the movement, the direction in which the counterculture was heading, as he stated that in the early 70s, the left had been, he stated the left had been poisoned by their own anger. So the value of the counterculture movement lied in the fact that they were never recognized to be aiming to bring about a change in the political foundation of their nation. Rather, it was simply a literary and spiritual venture documenting their lives, their experiences, and their encounters. And the case was never that they encouraged their reckless behavior, their reckless youthful behavior onto their readers. They never encouraged their readers to adopt their lifestyle. And in this sense, it was truly American in its forms and its ideals. And it was born out of a nation that had been granted so much freedom and comfort that they needed to reject all of it in order to find a sense of meaning and self. So although to many people the movement represented unpatriotic tendencies and destruction of traditional morals, the movement reflected the American ideals of free speech and expression, equality, and the pursuit of happiness. So it was never the goal of the movement to impose their ideas and beliefs on others around them, and they were simply exercising their right to establish their own sense of belonging within the community that they had created. So in this sense, I think it is accurate to state that the Beat movement embodied the American counterculture, and as they had given birth to this notion of freedom and rebellion and resistance that is still being emulated and celebrated today. And that is the end of my presentation. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Again, right on time. No need to exert any violence upon my presenters today, which is great. I really appreciate it. Again, we'll leave questions for the last part of the session. In fact, I have one or two in mind for the two presenters already, but it is not a threat. It's simply some couple of things I would like to discuss. So let's move on with onto our third presenter, Shika Thakur. Title of the paper, Invisible, a review of transcendentalism as a timeless therapeutic philosophy addressing COVID-led insanity. Shika, the floor is yours.
So there's some problem in the voice. I'm not very sure if my name has been called out. Am I audible? Am I audible?
Yes, it is your turn. Can you hear me?
Perfect.
Hello?
Yes, sir. But then there's
Okay,
distortion.
good. So yeah, we
Yes,
have
sir.
some, yeah. Go ahead.
Okay. Okay. So I may just begin now. Honorable Chair, respected fellow presenters, a very good morning to all. So the title of my paper is Invisible, a review of transcendentalism as a timeless therapeutic philosophy addressing COVID-led insanity. So I would want to initiate with the quote by Sylvia Plath. I felt my lungs inflate with the onrush of scenery, air, mountains, trees, people. I thought this is what it is to be happy. Unquote. Just a moment. Okay, so I have chosen H.D. Thoreau, an American essayist, his landmark work, Walden, and I have tried studying how transcendentalism is a uh, uh, it's a timeless philosophy which has not just catered to the welfare of people at one point in time, but is also useful to us at this point in time when COVID-led insanity has brought universe to a screeching halt. So we all know about H.D. Thoreau. He's an American essayist, poet, and a philosopher known to have gained accolades for fortifying the philosophy of transcendentalism, which was otherwise found by his master guide friend Ralph Emerson. Amidst rapid industrialization, when people were complaining about not having choice in lifestyle pertaining to not having time for oneself, for their over engagement with progression, work, materialism, etc., that was the time when Thoreau decided to take up an experiment. The experiment in the woods, by the woods, with the woods, from the woods, meticulously recorded in his masterpiece, Walden, or Life in the Woods, written in 1854, which is a series of 18 essays, comprehensively elucidating Thoreau's deliberate experience of 2 years, 2 months, and 2 days, which is otherwise compressed in the time span of 1 year in the memoir. Transcendentalism, as we all know, is a 19th century American school of philosophical thought that looks up to nature as a healing source of the self. Enmeshed in spiritualism, environmentalism, individualism, social reform, etc., Transcendentalism has timelessly and progressively celebrated the basic strand of human survival, the survival which is at the crossroads now. Thoreau attempts to prove that the ultimate purpose of life is to live a true life by restraining the material desires. By he has used the eponymous title, that is the pond named Walden, as a symbol of whole ecosystem where he can freely commune with the universal soul and strive to establish a harmonious relationship with the nature. Walden, comprising of 18 chapters, wherein every chapter has its own title, theme, each dealing with his brief stay there, such that every title talks about one of his experiences alongside the pond. So there are a lot many chapters, obviously 18 chapters, each has a title, starting with, I'll just give a rough idea of what he majorly talks about, starting with economy, where he majorly criticizes American lifestyle and persuades people to not persuades people to live a simple but a free life. To moving on to chapter 2, where he talks about the philosophy of living in the woods. Then he moved on to next chapter, where he urges people to read massively in order to grow and travel places in the mind, through mind itself, to so on and so forth, to conclusion, where he gives the summary of why he chose do that experiment. Apparently, through the successful culmination of the experiment, spending ample time in the woods, delimiting the material resources, toppling the working hours from 6 day week and 1 day rest to 6 day rest and 1 day week, Thoreau laid the new foundation of living a different lifestyle, a lifestyle people of the era were actually not aware of. Drawing parallel with the current times when the COVID-19 has brought the world to a screeching halt, transcendentalism seemed to have offered curative measures to combat the mental distress, the trauma obliteration in the 21st century as the byproduct of extended lockdown, massively annihilating the mental peace, fomenting suicide rates worldwide, is apparently smothered by incorporating the transcendental tendencies. American lifestyle based on Western philosophy, which is on a linear scale. You live only once and that you have to achieve everything in one damn life. While Indian lifestyle based on Eastern philosophy, where you look at life in cyclic manner. You die, you take birth, you live, you die. You take birth, you live, you die. So that's a cyclic cycle that Indians situate their lifestyle on, which is again the Eastern philosophy. Whereas when amidst COVID-19, which has blurred the boundaries of continents, regions, philosophies, lifestyles, it has uniformly affected all. From wanting to live to fullest for there's just one life in Western-led linear philosophy to doing things while keeping in mind karma, which is again an integral tenor of Eastern-led cyclic philosophy. COVID-19 has disintegrated the worldviews, with rapid increase in unemployment leading to depression, suicides, violence, chaos. The paper meticulously offers transcendentalism as a healing discourse, a sudden shift from city to village, urban to rural, materialism to spiritualism, and collectivism to individualism, collapsing the discourse in the current times, has comprehensively reinstated transcendentalism as a timeless, limitless philosophy. The detailed analysis of man-animal relationship in Walden lucidly displays Thoreau as a realist for his deep concern of the contemporary social issues. His retreat to nature is not an escape, but an attempt to put his belief into practice, aiming to find a model reinstating social harmony. Apparently, the focus of the paper now shifts from objective to subjective approach of life. Times when society only recognized one totalizing approach, objective approach of life, that is linear lifestyle marked with massive materialism, intense workload. Thoreau's experiment recorded in Walden has successfully projected a fresh model referring to harmonious coexistence between man and nature with minimum workload and massive spiritualism. Contrarily, conclusively, the paper defines how Thoreau's experiment provided a subjective approach to otherwise pervasive objective approach of life, questioning the exactness and fixity of objectivity for its intolerance to deviation. Subjectivity celebrates fluidity, plausibly giving way to the current COVID-led crisis. The visible crisis that has given invisible meanings to solve spiritual and environmental crises, this paper sets in the tenor. Now the conclusion, a very short conclusion. Despite several researches done so far on transcendentalism and Walden and Thoreau, this paper stands characteristically afresh for its engagement with transcendentalism as a free fluid signifier beyond boundaries, curing the depressed states in the wake of COVID outburst, smudging linear and cyclic lifestyles, Western and Eastern philosophies, while concomitantly projecting subjectivity over objectivity. This paper reviews transcendentalism as a timeless therapeutic philosophy addressing COVID-led insanity, hence making the invisible visible. Thank you so much. That's all.
Thank you so much, Shilja. Thank you for a very interesting paper. I'm sorry that we had some background noise, but I hope we have a few minutes at the end of the panel to talk about COVID. I remember a few months ago I was visiting with some of my dear friends in India, precisely talking about COVID.
Sure.
Thank you so much, and thank you also for sticking to the time, even you've left a couple of minutes unused.
Manuel,
Yes,
may I say
Matthew?
something? Yeah, because we have one speaker who is missing, so the speakers can take a couple of minutes extra. They don't have to rush through their presentation. So you
Thank you
can
so
give
much.
them,
Yeah,
you can give them 2 minutes extra, 2 or 3 minutes extra.
I was about to interrupt Shika, but I didn't want to really get her out of focus. But yeah, you don't need to rush things up, and so far you've been doing great. And I've been taking into account the few extra minutes that you are getting. So do not rush through. Okay. So, if you don't mind, we continue with our fourth panelist, Ruti Kaur, with the paper titled From the Room to the Road, Reading Spaces and Movements of the Beats through Jack Kerouac's On the Road. So, Ruti, floor is yours. I see you now.
Good morning, sir. Thank you for welcoming me. My paper is titled From the Room to the Road, Reading Spaces and Movements of the Beats Through Kerouac's On the Road. So the idea of speciality has been an important marker in the identity formation of the American land. With the history of immigration, American dream, and exchange, the road and the movement added a peculiar character to the country. This trait got an altogether different dimension post World War II with the arrival of the Beat movement, for whom road became life. On the one hand, while road was a marker of mobility, of access, and gave them a sense of global consciousness, on the other hand, their frantic search and constant movement and directionlessness was a resistance to a superstructure, the mainstream culture of the developing American land. My understanding of space here is derived from the fact that human interactions not only produce social relations and values, however, those values in turn produce social spaces. However, in contrast to this understanding, the constant movement and flux of the B generation and the dissociation of places in their mind maps and their lifestyle was a resistance to the production of this space, and thus the production of space remained an ambiguous entity through and through their life. I would like to give some examples through the text. So the novel gives us a glimpse into a very few rooms, beginning from Jack Kerouac's room in San Francisco, where he's living with his mother, to Hal Chase's room in Denver, and then by the end we see Henry's room. These are all his friends. The story is primarily based on Jack and Neil's life, the association of these two important beat writers, and since we just see a structure of the room, and to put an emphasis on the fact that I am saying a room and not a home, because we are not allowed as readers, we are not given a glimpse of what transpires within those four walls. So it's on one hand, it's primarily a structure of the four walls, and secondly, we do not get an insight of the social relationships of the conversations transpiring between individuals, let alone the architectural structure of the house. And the moment we tend to get that sense of intimacy of the conversations happening between the individuals, it is that very moment where the room breaks open on the road, and there's a disjunct and the continuity breaks. It is like the private space gives way to the public arena, and it intermingles so smoothly, the transition goes so smooth that the public space almost the private space almost gets lost in the overpowering public space. To my understanding, what Kerouac has done in the novel, he has give us an alternative to the rooms as such. He has interpreted rooms in the forms of cars, buses, trains, and bars. Most importantly, cars. Cars here are signifiers. What we see, people are traveling from one place to the other, and or there are episodes of cars stealing and running away. So there's a constant movement where people are trying to travel from one place to another and are in constant preoccupation to reach to their final destination. It's after a certain point of time, we tend to get a sense of a Beckett-like world where people are coming together and going on. Everything keeps on happening. The movement is so continuous and fluid, and it just revolves around the same thing, people coming on and going on, but then nothing is happening. Nobody's actually spending time to have an association with the other person, and let alone with the outside world. So the only people whom we find some kind of intimacy is with the narrator Sal and his friend Dean, who are representatives of Jack Kerouac and Neil Cassidy. However, what we see by the end of the third book, these two friends, as they reach and they are brooding in their solemnity about how they have lost their lives, how they have ruined their families, and um, how they have lost the prospects of their future realities. However, that solemnity is soon broken when Neil says, and I quote, "Now really, Jack, let's dig everything as we go along." So that preoccupation of going on, that preoccupation with the movement breaks through every sensitive or possible understanding or possible contact. So the mind space is mapped. Then the mind space of these beat people are mapped. They are, in the sense that they remain preoccupied from the beginning of the novel. From the beginning of the novel to the end, Jack says, "Where is Neil?" He remains preoccupied. And while Neil remains preoccupied with the sense that he wants to be on the road, some people might also think that the novel is about the association with the pimp girls with the men who are, but then at the end of the novel, Neil realizes that I had rued the way I had broken up the purity of my trip by fooling around with this girl. So the road, the trip, is the pure sanctity. It is where the sanity of that individual lies, and not in relationship with the other person, even if the sexual acts might give them pleasure, but then those are not the purpose that they are looking for. So the book gives us the term that these beat people are con men, to quote, as they are feigning some kind of pretense, some kind of reality, where they are always in their own state of mind trying to make sense of their own reality, irrespective of what transpires in the world outside. So to by the end of the book, we see that the only relation these people associate is with the wilderness, with the open spaces. As Neil says, I realize the jungle takes you over and you become it. The atmosphere and I became the same. So, as we, in a general perspective, we might say that home is where the heart is, but we would never hear a Neil Cassidy saying home is where the heart is, because he doesn't belong to a home. The home was not a stable place. It was the wilderness, it was the open spaces where they actually allowed themselves to transpire and experience who they were actually. So in a sense, their conceived reality, what they think of the world, always superseded the lived experience of their lived experience with the outside world. So I would just conclude with a single sentence, uh, stating that their space was always in a state of becoming. It was never constant. It was always in a state of flux. Thank you so much.
Sir, you are muted.
I'm sorry, my bad again. I was muted. I was saying that thank you so much for very interesting presentations, Ruthie. And as it happens, I am visiting with you from Laredo, Texas. And as a reader of On the Road, you will know what it means in the novel. It is the entry to Mexico. It is the entry to the new American West.
True.
And so we'll have the chance, I hope, to talk about this, even if in passing only. But thank you so much again, Ruthie. And
Thank you
you've
so
been
much, sir.
wonderful with time. You had a few minutes left. I'm sorry, I shouldn't have given signal with my hand. I didn't want
No,
to upset you or get you nervous.
that gave me a perspective to wind up on time. Thank you.
Okay, so we are going on to move to our fifth and final panelist, since one of our original presenters is not attending, and will be, Bishant Ramteke will be presenting with a paper titled Bit Generation and the Nonconformity. So, Bishant?
Yes. Hi, good morning. Shall I start?
Yes, please.
Hi. Yes, thank you. So the topic of my presentation is beat generation and the non-conformity. And to assert these ideals, to assert that were prevalent in this movement, I've taken three texts by Jack Kerouac on the road, one by Allen Ginsberg, Howl, and Stephen Davis's biography of Jim Morrison. So I'll start with the history of post-war America, which is of the subcultures. For example, the outlaw motorcyclist gangs today, which are famous as Hell's Angels, one of the many examples of subcultures. But I'll keep my focus on the beat movement. So this was the first major step that brought a sea of change in the cultural and social milieu of America. And although beat movement was limited to the American continent, but it ushered a globalized and anti-establishment counterculture of the 60s. So the origins of the word beat were quite obscure, but due to time constraints, we'll only discuss what Kerouac meant, and the definitions will attest to what he gave. So according to Kerouac, beat meant people who were exhausted, who were broke, who were downtrodden. But he also gave a connotation, those who rejected the oppressive world around them and transformed exhaustion into defiance. They further reached towards religious transformation, and that is what he means by beatitude. There were many influences which shaped and nurtured the ideals that Beat generation stand for. For example, there was the Lost generation, who were quite similar to the Beat generation since both of them survived two catastrophic wars. Both of them became disillusioned. And so they explored, they experimented, they sought new values and pioneered new modes of expression. The only difference was that the Beat generation were very interested in mysticism and Eastern religions and spirituality. There was hipsterism. Hipsters represented were the people who represented the code of conduct that was directly opposed to the puritanical Anglo-Saxon ethic of the society. Hipsters were also socially marginalized, and often bordered on criminality. Then there was bohemianism, from whom the Beats borrowed the aspects of unconventionality, romantic egoism, and anti-materialistic ethic. There was Dadaism and Surrealism. Now, Dadaists and Surrealists were the artists who attacked and challenged the bureaucracy, the military, the hypnosis-induced television, and the effects of mass media, public indifference and conformity and complacency. And Dadaist and Surrealist uh, oppose these prevalent values through their arts. So in this sense, Dadaism, Surrealism, and Beat generation were the art movements, the cultural movements that tried to bring change. There was also Transcendentalism, who opposed and criticized the American materialism at the time. So now I'll begin with a very short a description of Jack Kerouac's On the Road. I won't discuss, obviously, in detail the summary, but only touch upon the aspect of nonconformity, anti-establishment. So On the Road is a hymn to the American dream of self-reliance, of individualism, and of freedom. Uh, on the surface, obviously, the motive is journey, but it is on a deeper level. It is also a quest for identity. It is a quest for spiritual knowledge, and the tone of the novel is that of urgency, determination, and hope. The narrator of the novel, Salvatore Paradise, is someone who continuously moves, and he moves so with speed in order to shed the social constructs imposed by the society, imposed by the schools, imposed by the organization, imposed by the family, uh, in order to find, and he tries to shed them in order to find his true self. One can draw parallels between Sal Paradise and a pilgrim who leaves society behind in order to find God, in order to find himself, in order to achieve paradise. So, and this is quite symbolic that the name of the narrator itself is Salvatore Paradise. Salvatore meaning savior, and paradise, as you already know. Um, so Sal Paradise becomes the adventurer of the outer world, and who journeys to become a compulsive explorer of the world within. There is another character, which is Dean Moriarty, modeled after Neil Cassidy. Now, Dean Moriarty is an ambiguous figure. He is an embodiment of Kerouac's beatific hero who throws himself into the subcultures of the American society, underbelly of the American society, for example, the bars, the ghettos, the cafes, the downtown clubs found in the cities. He's someone who is described as desperate for kicks. He wears himself out to live grandly. In fact, William Burroughs describes Neil as someone whose very soul of the voyage is pure, abstract, meaningless motion. Wife may starve, friends exist only to exploit gas money. Neil must move. This is the new kind of American that who is obsessed with amphetamines, who are obsessed with traveling across the US with restless motion. So Neil is embodiment, and so Dean Moriarty is an embodiment of someone who rejects the bourgeois family values, someone who experiments with crime, someone who experiments with homosexual activity, racial integration, everything that is considered as illegal during that time. Now, On the Road was not as explicit or was not as direct as Howl was, as William Carlos Williams wrote the preface and warned the Howl reader, hold back the edges of your gowns, ladies. We are going through hell. As only very few artists portrayed a terrifying picture of physical, emotional, and spiritual collapse. Jonah Ruskin, another author, wrote, Howl was a dangerous and wonderfully submersive poem. Uh, uh, Now, Allen Ginsberg was influenced by transcendentalists who attacked American materialism, and it is very natural that he followed the same path. And he attacked American capitalism, which he represented as Moloch in his poem. Now, this indictment grew scathing in the following years, as Ginsberg in an interview once said that the CIA doesn't do the dirty work anymore, the corporations do. And this poem was designed to be read aloud within a scope of single breath. It was meant to be an emotional time bomb that would continue exploding military industrial nationalistic complex. Howl was responsible for collapsing natural boundaries and encouraged cultural rebellion across the world. 5 minutes? Okay. So while reading Howl, one comes to terms with the notions of criminality, obscenity, madness, and the breaking of boundaries. The violation of taboo and all sort of things are not simply an act of rebellion against the rationality and order and organization. It is also a medium through which the individual comes across his destructiveness and transforms it into a creative energy. I'll now conclude with the effects of the Beat generation on the counterculture with a very short description of Jim Morrison and the Doors. So the Doors were a band, a rock band, which was formed in the halcyon days of the counterculture and who strictly adhered to the anti-establishment code. And the Beats, especially Jack Kerouac's On the Road, played a very influential role on Jim Morrison's persona. As Raymond Manzarek, the keyboardist of the Doors, once said that the Doors wouldn't have formed if uh, On the Road hadn't been published. Jim Morrison, who regarded himself as a poet more than a rock singer, modeled himself after Dean Moriarty and was particularly attracted towards the constant and untrammeled and untraveled movement of Dean. He was also attracted to his delinquency. As Stephen Davis, the biographer, says, Jim Morrison was a walking impulse disorder. He was a sociopath. He was a public nuisance, a human fly, and a family outcast. He also described himself as a huge fiery comet that everyone stops to look at and is awestruck by it. It rings a very familiar bell with Kerouac's description of interesting people who burn and burn like fabulous yellow Roman candles. Um, Apart from that, Jim Morrison was greatly influenced by Arthur Rimbaud, who also influenced the Beat generations, and enthusiastically attested to the philosophy of systemized derangement of the senses. Shall I continue? Hello.
Yes, please. Yes, please. Yes, Vishant.
Okay, thank you.
Sorry,
To
I was muted. Yeah, go ahead. You have a couple of minutes left. Sure.
Okay, thank you so much. So to mark the end of my presentation, I would like to also name a few more luminaries who were influenced by the Beat generation and were the product of the counterculture. For example, there was the Harvard professor Timothy Leary, who made famous the phrase "turn on, tune in, drop out," which meant activating your neural genetic equipment. Tuning meant interacting harmoniously with the world around you. Dropout meant voluntary detachment from involuntary commitments like school, military, and corporate employment. There was George Carlin, the famous American comedian who was dubbed as the dean of the counterculture comedians, and whose subjects of criticism was criticism and comedy and lampoon were the American society, American culture, family, parenting, mass media, and he spoke openly on drug usage, politics, philosophy, and psychology. And there was Alan Watts, who is considered as someone who introduced mystic Buddhism, Eastern religious philosophical traditions to the modern world and popularized these traditions during the counterculture of the 60s. So I'd like to end my presentation with this. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Vishnu. And so this comes as a closing paper, and it is time now for a Q&A
Sure.
period. I think we have like about 20 minutes or so left. And before I leave the floor to all of you, I would like to say a couple of things. First, thank you all for your very interesting presentations. It's been really great to revisit with this generation and to revisit with my own past. I am not that old as to have been a contemporary of theirs, but I am a direct inheritor, and I grew up in the post-beat, post-hippie, post-many things world. And as such, I think all the papers put together have offered a very interesting, valuable, panoramic review of the period. Obviously, it is. I mean, it would take us a very long time, and long discussion to really just start scratching under the surface and get deeper into all the implications of this time. That, in many senses, and that is one of the questions I will pose to you all, is times that are so amazingly similar to our own times and to what we are living right now in the midst of this nonsensical crisis that perhaps you uh, explain or come up with some conclusion in that respect. But I mean, we are talking of yeah, it is the time, the Second World War, which completed the destruction of the First World War, it meant the end of the final closure of an era and the beginning of the one that we are inhabiting right now. And these are the times of the postmodern condition. This is precisely in the late 40s and the 50s when the postmodern, not only postmodernism, but the postmodern condition begins. It is the time of the hardcore existential philosophy or existentialist philosophy. It is the time of the theater of the absurd. It is the time when we acquire this feeling of fragmentation, of being dysfunctional beings, incomplete beings, left alone, left stranded in a meaningless void, in a world that is nonsensical. And the Beats were the pioneers, but they were also the the ones who try to reconcile the idea of America, the idea of the United States, its past with its present. And the road for Kerouac is is attempt at reinterpreting or renewing meaning to the American landscape, especially the east, west, north, south polarity of the country. So, and I would continue if I had the time. I don't want to take over and become the protagonist of all this. This is also the time, the beat generation, the time of the nuclear threat, the time of the fear of the communist enemy. It is the time of disillusion, hopelessness for a generation that has participated either in person or their parents in the war. A generation that is going to enter the Korean War in 1950, the Vietnam War in 1955, and so on and so forth. So it is a crucial time, not only in the history of the United States, but in world history. And again, and I get back to my original question, perhaps you'll be kind enough to somehow bring some wisdom from the big times to our own times, and perhaps some learning and some help we can get from those great writers and intellectuals and whatnot. So, and then I had another one in mind, but I leave it there. I don't know whether I made myself clear. I don't know whether what I said makes any sense, but basically I'm asking you to somehow compare one period with the other, those times with our times, and see whether there's any similarity, connection, or even learning we can draw from back then.
I think Gabriela has something to say. Gabby, do you?
Well, you need to unmute yourself, Gabriela, because you are
I know.
silenced.
Correct. No, I just wanted, first of all, I really appreciate all the mentions to music that you guys have done. I study music. I love this. But I have a question. In Canada, Leonard Cohen was like the big representative of the beat generation, and you guys haven't talked about him. And obviously, well, I lived in Canada a big chunk of my life, so I'm wondering why nobody touched on him.
I have a very good idea because Gabby is going to chair a session later. So Gabby, you keep it in mind. You are going to talk in detail about Leonard Cohen. Yeah, sounds good.
Gabriela, again, you are muted, so you are voiceless.
I know, but I already made my question.
Okay.
And Gabriela, in your session, well, the subject is more or less the same, so you can continue. And if you're still awake in the third session, I know it is well past midnight in your part of the world. If you're still awake, then in the third session today, we actually have two speakers who will not be turning. No, we have one speaker who will not be turning up. So, well, it's all yours. We can talk about music and we can talk about the things that you like to do. Generally in a conference, as you know, the first day or the opening sessions are devoted to the background, to the history, and to an introduction of the main theme. And this is what we are doing today. So we are talking about the movements, we are talking about the major trends and issues, and I think we have begun very well in that respect. However, there must be some questions coming up, something, and even the speakers are invited to come up with a few things that they may not have said while they were making their presentations. There is Sachidanand Mohanty also here. Sachi, your video is not being switched on. because there is something wrong at your end. We have tried, but it's not getting switched on from here. Professor Sachidanand Mohanty is a very senior professor, and he has been the Vice Chancellor of the Central University of Odisha. He is settled there in Odisha now, and he's with us today. So we welcome questions, comments from all of you. Come on, let's see how great you are in your discussions.
So I think we should
Okay,
start.
let me give you another tip. Just a second. Think of Whitman. Think of Thoreau. Think of Roger Williams, the founder of the state of Rhode Island. Think of that long line of resistance, of rebels, of heterodox thinkers who resist totalitarianism, resist the war, resist many of the evils that befell upon the world in the 20th
And
century.
Laltlan Kimi was, she was racing through her paper thinking that she would run short of time. Perhaps you may wish to elaborate some of the points that you just rushed through. Laltlan Kimi. You are muted. You are muted. Yeah.
Thank you. Thank you so much, ma'am. So I was able to cover most of the things that I wanted to cover. I was very, yes, I was worried that I was going to run out of time because I'm very punctual in that matter. However, I skipped over some parts about how many beat writers were, condemning the violence on the left-wing radical American politics of the 1960s. And I think that's very important to mention because what we're seeing nowadays is that once you are either black or white, you are either, left-wing or right-wing. That's what I think we have been seeing most of in popular culture. And the fact that, counterculture founders like Allen Ginsberg and Jack Kerouac were not afraid to call out, violence on the left and condemning them. I think that was very important because I think there is a lack of diversity in thought in politics and culture as we're seeing of today. So I think that is what is need to be considered, and I think we have to take into account that people can have different thoughts, and we don't have to label them any particular name or slur. And I think they were influential in that part of the movement also. Thank you. That's all I can say.
The impact of Beat Generation was felt all over the world and also in India. And around that time, particularly the ideas of free love, make love, not war, and, the drug menace, which actually I think was precipitated around then. In India at that time, and most of you who are listening in were probably not born then, so you may not know. There was this film that was brought out then. It was called Hare Rama, Hare Krishna, and it talked about the influence of the beats on this generation, which came into India, went to Nepal, and they lived on drugs and marijuana and so on. Then related to that is also the Woodstock Festival. And I'm sure, Manuel, you remember the Woodstock Festival, the music festival in 1969. And that also caught the imagination of the young by storm. So there is really so much that we can talk about in relation to beat music. But what about the other presenters? What about the other people on the screen and in the background? Are there any comments or anything?
Yes,
Ma'am, I would like to say something.
Yes, Shruti.
In relation, may I speak?
Yes.
Yeah, in relation to Sir's point that he mentioned, if I could see some similarity between Beat Generation and the present times of this insane crisis that we are living in. While the Beat Generation was completely, understood to be anti-establishment and rebellious and radical in their outlook towards the society, what we are today experiencing is a call, is an alarm for us to not really be anti-establishment, but be self-sufficient and take the reins in our own hands, and not really, you know, actually be following the diktats of the governance, in if I may put it like that. Um so this is a parallel that I see, that it's a time that we think for ourselves, and not really be, you know, disillusioned is the right word to say, with what the norms had been up till now. This is in response to what sir said, and I apologize to Gabriela ma'am, because I think we are all slaves of canon, so we missed on that Canadian writer. Probably we'll all look into his
Don't
writings
worry.
now.
Okay, ma'am. Can I
Usually
say, ma'am?
worries,
And
Ruthie.
also, if I can add to my presentation, I don't think I was lacking on time, but I still have something more to say. Can I go on?
I
Yep.
think so, yes. Manju?
Yeah. Do I have time, ma'am?
Yes, Shruti, go ahead for the next 2 minutes, please.
Okay, sure. So I was talking about spaces and movement. So I just deliberately escaped the part of the form in the novel. So I would like to show, I don't know if it's visible clearly. So since we cannot, have a PowerPoint presentation, so this was a format the novel was written in, and to share my experience, it was very difficult to read it in this format because there was no spacing. Deliberately, Kerouac wrote in this style because he skipped the spaces in between the lines, and also there were no clear demarcation between the chapters, which we are all used to. And also, the book is divided into 5 parts. While those parts were not clearly mentioned, they'll come somewhere in the between, where at the end of the line they'll mention book 2. It begins abruptly, so even the form of the novel takes up the uh, space of its own, in a sense that you will not realize that uh, how within a page it's more like a new critical approach towards writing a novel, where you are just focused on the words. You are just trying to make sense of what the events are, how the events are unfolding one after the other. The movement is so swift, the space just expands through words and not actions. Yeah, that's from my part. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Shruti. I think Eman has to say something. I can go ahead. Unmute
Okay.
Shah.
Okay, ma'am. As Manju ma'am mentioned about Hare Krishna movement and even movie Hare Krishna, Hare Rama. So Ginsberg was a part of Hare Krishna movement, Allen Ginsberg. Even Allen Ginsberg and Peter Orlovsky, who came to India in 1975 for the movement or for the part of Hare Krishna movement. Even I did not mention in my paper about the similarities between Walt Whitman and Ginsberg. If we talk about Walt Whitman and Ginsberg, Whitman, who gave thought of individualism. So we can say he is a spokesperson of individualism in American culture. And there are 3 similarities in between them, Walt Whitman and Ginsberg. Both of them were homosexuals. Both of them used long lines in their poems. And third thing, both of them celebrated individualism. So anyhow, the idea given by Walt Whitman is preceded by, they influenced by Walt Whitman. Okay, this is the thing I wanted to say.
Vishant has raised the hand. I think Vishant, any concluding remark you want to make?
Sorry.
Right, unmute.
Yeah. So not concluding remarks, but I'd like to just reassert the idea that Shruti Gaur said when Jack Kerouac did not create any paragraphs. So the beat poets and the beat writers, they adopted various innovative methods. For example, as Shruti said, Jack Kerouac adopted. He wanted to encapsulate the immediacy of his travels, and that is why he wrote it on a single piece of scroll, and amphetamine-riddled ecstasy and creativity. Allen Ginsberg, he wrote Howl, and was supposed to be read as a single in one single breath. Each verse is supposed to be read in one single breath. William Burroughs, he adopted the cut-up method, which was so famously used by surrealists and the Dadaists. So I think it was every other poet had to voice their emotions as honestly and as directly as possible, and they wanted to capture the experiences that they lived into the words themselves. So it's just a recapitulation of what Shruti said. Thank you.
I had a quick question if the panel would like to take it.
Yes, Bhavna, please go ahead.
Thank you, ma'am. So it's not a question as in general wonderment. I think Amin in his paper, very engaging though it was talking about a lot about homosexuality, homosexual writers, and drugs, etc. So I'm just wondering whether lifestyle choices, and these are not, products of particular generation. I mean, you have Coleridge was opium addicted, for example, and as far back as Shakespeare has mostly been called bisexual for that matter. So I'm just wondering whether lifestyle choices of writers or poets or thinkers of a particular age do contribute to the epoch making procedure or mechanism. Do they or do they not? And if they do, then to what extent do we understand literature as being marked by personal lifestyle choices of people who are behind the production mechanism? Thank you.
Amin, you would like to take it because it was addressed to you.
Okay, just see, there were many writers who took opium, like Coleridge, as you said, Shakespeare was homosexual. But
I don't know for sure, but there are
it's not.
speculations about a lot of writers along those lines. So
By their works, people predict. So one thing, generally people or the writers, they did not want to reveal their identity. And particularly if you see beat writers, they celebrate their identity. They openly accepted that. Even other writers, if you say the names like Shakespeare and other who were homosexuals, they intentionally hide their identity. And maybe that if you're talking about opium and drug addicts, so it has been dear to the writers and the poets of from many countries and poets from many centuries. So
Yeah.
yes, they celebrate it. They thought that it enhances creativity, and whatever they faced, they wrote, they presented in their works.
Yes, we have
Manuel, may I say something?
Yes, but then we have Sakshi. She's been waiting for quite a while with her hand raised, so Manju, after you, please.
No, Manuel, I just have a suggestion. After Sakshi, you may just wrap it up because you see the same subjects will continue in the next session also at 11:30 in half an hour's time. So you may wrap it up after Sakshi. Yeah?
Yes.
Sakshi?
You are muted. Okay.
Yeah. Am I audible now, sir? So thank you everyone for a very thought-provoking session. I had many ideas. Shruti's paper gave me an idea that whether the concept of home that you are exploring has, I was thinking about how on the road is, is so pro-travel that it is also anti-woman at the same time. So I don't know. So, traditionally when women are considered with wilderness, and here, Sal and Din Moriarty are not looking, not associating the traditional idea of wilderness and womanhood, but actually going back to the nature. I think that is also liberating, that women, yes, they represent a sort of stationary life. Women represent home, and they deliberately are rejecting that life in favor of road travel and then going back to a nature. So it probably has to do with their whole idea of freedom, that they don't want to be tied down. But even though it is a celebration of travel, it sits very uneasily as with respect to the women characters. But that's another probably story. What I was again reminded of was the hungry poets of Patna. And the hungryless movement, it started before the beat generation, Ellen Ginsberg. They have a very direct correlation. When Ginsberg came to Patna, and there was this Indian movement, and they also got widely published outside. There was a lot of intellectual give and take, so much so that the hungry poets of Patna, in one of the articles I read, that they introduced Ginsberg to his motif of a fish, that a fish with three body, or a fish with three heads, or something like that. And there was also, they also had a manifesto, and some people say that that manifesto influenced the manifesto of Beat Generation. So I see a connection between, now forgotten movement in India and this very popular American movement. So in a way, while thinking about Beat Generation, I'm also reminded of, movements back home that were, intellectually, they were concurrent, they were talking to main writers at the same time. And as for, we are talking about apolitical stance of beat writers. In the same article I was reading, it said that when Ginsberg came to India, he would take shower naked in public spaces, and that his nakedness was a political stance. He wanted to say that, how far the society would allow them to express their nakedness as both as an aesthetic and political act. So I think, related to Bhavna, that their life was itself very political. They were making a political, being apolitical is also politics. So I think that that came out very well. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Sakshi. And yeah, time is up, folks. It's been my great pleasure to share this time with you all. And let me tell you, it's so very gratifying to see the young ones. I am, because I am among the old ones now, and the old crowd. Uh, so buzzing with ideas and energy and stamina and love for literature and love for what we do and for American studies. So congratulations. I have to excuse myself because it is getting to be the small hours of the night back here in Laredo, Texas. So I think I need to keep my bed. But I'll try my best to join you all again. I don't know, tomorrow sometime. I will get up early and see whether I can still catch up some other presentations. But hey, Nanju and company, you know how to get a hold of me. Just reach out if I can be of help in any sense. And this is, obviously, I'm making this extensive to all of you. And what can I say to wrap this up beyond saying that this has been a very, very valuable glimpse at this ocean that the beat and what came after the beat represents. That we had more time and more energy to discuss many of the many topics and things that come up, at least in my mind. So thank you so much, everybody, and have a wonderful day. I say good night and good day again. We are both now on the same day, which is good. That we are both in the present. Okay. Mind you, anybody else? Is there anything else I can do before logging out?
Thank you so much, sir. What a fruitful discussion it was. And we are going to continue with the session 2, that is also related to the movements. We will see the different aspects related to the movement, the writers, and let's see, and which will be chaired by none other than the person who is talking about the Canadian writers right now. So, ma'am Gabriella, we will see you. So thank you so much, everyone, for being the part of the discussion. Brown Canessa, thank you so much, and good night to you. Okay, thank you everyone. See you at 11:30 for the next session. Please log on at 11:20 sharp. So to check the audio and video system. Thank you so much,
Bye,
everyone.
Manolo.
Bye, Manolo. And
Bye bye.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.
So good to see you.
Good to see you.
Okay.
Yeah.
So are we on now?
In 10 minutes, you can come back. Grab
Oh.
yourself some coffee to stay awake.
Okay.
I'll go down and get myself some coffee meanwhile.
Yes, ma'am, please do. Everyone, you have to log out because we can't end the meeting because it is the same link we are going to use for the second session. So you have
Thank you,
to
ma'am.
log out. Yeah, okay.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. Nice presentation.
Thank you,
Thank you,
ma'am.
Shruti. Nice to meet you again every time you are there.
Thank you.
Okay, Shruti. Bye-bye.
So we have to log off and then log on?
Yes, ma'am. You can take a coffee break of 10 minutes in between. We will see at 11:20.
What time is it then? There?
So, ma'am, let's log in at 11:20, but we are going to start at 11:30 sharp. Okay, ma'am.
Ma'am, is there a break of 10
Yes, ma'am. Yes, ma'am. There is a break of 10 minutes. We are going to join at 11:20 now for the second session.
Okay, thank you, ma'am.
Okay, ma'am.
Hi, Gabby.
Hi, Manju. How are you?
Fine.
I just sent you a video of people surfing in Marina. Yeah, we had a hurricane, so electricity goes off sometimes and internet goes off.
Yeah, it's happening, huh? Neeraj, in between we stop streaming live, huh?
Let me check, ma'am, if we have that option. Let me check.
Oh.
What time is it there?
11:20.
So it's like Delhi, right?
We have only one time zone across the country. Neeraj, are you there?
Yes, ma'am, he's there.
Sachidanand Mohanty is having problems logging into the session. So it says that the webmaster is not allowing him. And let's see if something can be done. I don't think it's from our end.
Because I can see him on the screen right now, but his
then
video is not visible.
no, it's not coming on. I tried.
Manju ma'am, I also talked with him.
Yeah.
So he was saying this thing. My Zoom is not working properly.
Okay. But
So I asked him to download TeamViewer
okay.
so that I can have look of his Zoom.
So for this session, I guess Gopika is already here. Then we have Ila Rathor. I can't see her. Kavita Dillon and Prikshika. Ruby. Ruby is here.
Ruby, you need more light on your face, please. I explained yesterday what the requirements were. Not enough light on your face.
I tried a lot, ma'am, but there is some
Switch
problem.
on the light in your room.
Yes, already switched on.
Some window, open some window.
Okay. Sure. It's inbuilt in the Zoom. If you go where it says
How
the
do I
video.
get out of it? How do I get out of it? I don't want it.
Stop video, ma'am.
Yeah, so choose virtual background, and it has a few of them. It has this one. See.
No, I don't know how to fix it. And I think on my laptop, it cannot be, I cannot have it. Huh? That's what one colleague told me. Ruby, still not enough light. कैसे अंधेरे कमरे में बैठे हो? हाँ? Kavita, please try and have some more light. Kopika, you're using a cell phone and not a laptop.
No, ma'am, I'm using the phone, yeah.
Why aren't you using a laptop? Because
yeah, there's some issue with the with the connectivity, actually, with the audio. But is this okay?
It's not advised for webinars.
Okay.
I explained yesterday.
All right, ma'am. No, should I then like not present or something? Is it
No, you must present. You must present because you're the first speaker. But
okay.
For future reference, please keep it in mind.
All right, ma'am.
So we have Kavita also with us now. We have Shaminaz.
Good morning, ma'am.
Shaminaz, the angle of your camera is not right. It should be higher. It should be your face level.
Hi. Ma'am, this much.
The camera should be higher. Camera should be higher. That's better. Make it better. Still more.
More.
Yeah. You're using a laptop? Yeah?
Yes, ma'am.
Put a thick book under your laptop. Okay. That will help.
Okay, ma'am. Then give me just 2 minutes.
We have 3 minutes to go. Ruby, the image of you is not satisfactory. You are muted.
Yes, ma'am. I have done my best, but it's not.
Is the room so dark?
No, ma'am. It's not dark.
but I don't know what is the problem.
Change the direction of your computer, face the window. We like the presentation of our webinars to be as perfect as possible. Monica, good to see you here. Unmute. Please unmute, Monica. Let us check your audio. Unmute, please.
Hello,
Yeah.
ma'am. How are you?
Yes, let's check your video, your audio. You did not turn up yesterday. Say something so that we know your audio is working properly.
Hello, ma'am. How are you?
Yeah,
Am I
I'm good.
audible, ma'am?
Yes, you're audible. You're audible. All right, Purnima. Purnima, you're muted. Do we show the video again? Because this is a fresh lot altogether.
Yes,
Yeah?
ma'am. Yes, ma'am.
And then we can start. It is 11:30, right?
Thank you so much, ma'am. Good morning, everyone, and welcome back to the second session for the day. And this session will revolve around the movements again. So in this session, it's my privilege and honor to introduce the chairperson of the session, Professor Gabriela Vargas, ma'am. Ma'am is a very renowned and established academician, active member of IASA, that is International American Study Association that spans more than 40 countries. Ma'am, it's an honor for all of us to have you here in this session. In this session, we will be having different presenters and the speakers. They will be talking about the movements. And these presenters are Gopika from Hyderabad, Ila Rathore from Chandigarh, Kavita Dhillon from Bhatinda, Pratishika from Gujarat, Ruby Jindal from Punjab, and Shabnaz Banu from Ahmedabad. So let me remind you all the presenters that make sure that your presentation is between 8 to 10 minutes only, and so that we have ample time for the discussion, right? So thank you so much, and over to you, Gabriela.
Ma'am, just for rectification, ma'am, I'm from Allahabad, not Ahmedabad.
Okay, Alham, okay, right. So over to you, Gabriela.
Thank you. My name is Gabriela Vargas Cetina, and I think I'm the only anthropologist today here. I'm an anthropologist, and I usually work these days on music mainly. So I was very interested in the previous session. So now we're gonna have 6 papers. Everybody's here, I guess. And the first one is gonna be by Gopika Sankar from the University of Hyderabad. And it's called Carving a Niche in the Real and Imagined Realms, Space and Place in Asian American Literature. Thank you.
Thank you, Gabriel. Yeah, So shall I start? Could I start? Am I audible?
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, okay, yeah. So as Gabriel has already read out my title, I'm talking about space and place in Asian American literature. That is quite a huge, wide topic, I know. So I'm just looking at a few novels here, and maybe if time permits, one or two poems, I'll just try to read out a few bits and pieces from that. But since we are talking about the movement, I'll just talk a little bit about Asian immigration to America. So right from the 1600s, probably the 17th century, you can see Asian presence in America. And but then it's towards the 19th century that the first wave of immigration starts in the full force. And then in 1965, with the Immigration and Nationality Act in America, and that is in the United States. So I'm talking about United States exactly here. So in the 1965, that Immigration and Nationality Act laws were made flexible, and that is when there was a huge surge in Asian migration to the United States. So Asian American literature now is defined as by people like King Kok Chong as literature by those of Asian descent who migrated to North America. But here I'm just looking at only the Asian literature as Asian American literature as you find in the United States. So the earliest immigrants to America include Filipino, Chinese, Korean, and Japanese, and then later we find more of the South Asian efflux too. And so again, all these are umbrella terms, and so these are not things that many of these immigrants are comfortable with. That is one thing that we have to note here. So maybe it's just for academic purposes or for political, whatever, those kind of, there's some kind of a politics behind this. So it's not that everybody who is grouped under this particular tag is very comfortable with this kind of an umbrella category. So if you look at South Asians, even you have Indian, Pakistani, Afghani, then Nepalis, Sri Lankan, so all kinds of immigrants put together under such tags, right? So these are all umbrella categories. So some of the major themes that you find in Asian American writings include identity politics, then generational conflicts, if you look at the mother-daughter conflicts and those kind of things, or even just even the father children relationships or the generational conflicts, then the first generation and the second generation, so those kind of things. Then you have a lot of things on multiculturalism. So you get a lot of ideas on multiculturalism from these writings. So these are some things that you find common in Asian American writings, but the newer writings are also exploring other things apart from the Asian American identity politics and issues like that. So that was something that I wanted to talk about too, but then I don't think there'll be enough time for that, so I'm not really going to talk about that. So some of the major writers of Asian American scenario include Kaluz Bulasan, Amy Tan, Bharti Mukherjee, then Jhumpa Lahiri, Maxine Hong Kingston, Gish Jain, Changreli, Mohsin Hamid, Khalid Hosseini, V.V. Ganeshananthan, and many others. So one major issue that they keep talking about is a model minority status that the Asian Americans had. So from this post 1965, that Immigration and Nationality Act, to the pre 9/11 days, that was a glorious period of Asian migration to America. And so during this period, Asian Americans were treated as a model minority. So, the minorities who had the right skills and who could contribute to the socio-cultural milieu and as well as the economic development and growth of America. So that way they were treated as model minorities. And this was an image that the first generation migrants were very proud to flaunt. But then you find that with the second generation and the subsequent generations, it's not something that really goes well with them because it's a kind of a burden on them. So does it call for an assimilation alone, or is it assimilation with acculturation? So these are some major questions that come up with this. So when we look at some of the representations of space and place in some of these writings, you get certain inputs on these ideas. Or certain inputs or ideas on this whole issue of multiculturalism, and then this model minority status, and whether it is the melting pot model that they try to flaunt, or is it the salad bowl multiculturalism that we find in these writings, or in general in Asian American spaces. So I'll just look at a few texts here. First, I'll look at Mohsin Hamid's The Reluctant Fundamentalist. Mohsin Hamid is a Pakistani American writer. And of course, he's been in different places, but for convenience sake, I'm just putting him as a Pakistani American writer, because Reluctant Fundamentalist is partially set in America, in the United States, and partially in Lahore. So here I'm looking at New York City. So throughout this paper, I'll be looking particularly at New York City. And what we find in Reluctant Fundamentalist is Chungus, the protagonist and the narrator. So when he initially goes to America, he first goes to New Jersey as an Ivy League graduate, as a student there. And so he's very happy with, it's a voluntary immigration. So it's not a forced immigration. He doesn't go there as an exile, but as a student, and he's very happy to be there in those spaces. And then when he goes to New York, he says that I'm not a, I'm in all these 4.5 years, I was a New Yorker. So it's not the American image, it's not the Asian American identity that he flaunts, but the image, but the identity of a New Yorker. But does this identity stay all along? That is a question that comes in here. So for that, if you look at the spaces that you find, he talks about how, what are the certain things that made him feel that he's a New Yorker. For instance, the streets of New York. So he says that these streets were really pedestrian friendly, and that reminds him of Lahore. So we see that how this going back to his homeland is actually coming there. All right, yeah. So then the cosmopolitan spirit that pervades in New York, that is another thing that actually draws him closer to New York. But with the 9/11, when the Twin Towers are falling, he suddenly feels that, okay, America was really arrogant and they deserved this kind of a thing with the fall of the World Trade Center, for fall of the Twin Towers. And the city too is the city which was very friendly with the migrants earlier. The city too starts treating him harshly. So both ways, it's not just that the city is harsh on the immigrant, even the migrant feels uncomfortable. So that is where you find that it is not just the strong multiculturalism that may be pervading there, but it's a kind of boutique multiculturalism, as Stanley Fish calls it. So if you look at New York in another text, for instance, in Namesake by Jhumpa Lahiri, there we see, the second generation is comfortable in a city like New York. For them, it's a beautiful city. On the other hand, for the first generation, it's a city of, chaos. So it's like those paroxysmal spaces. That is the kind of paroxysmal places. That is a universe which is constantly exploding. So the same Ashima who says that, New York is too much, too many cars, Ashima and Ashok Ashok says that actually, when he says New York is too much, too many cars, too many tall buildings, these people, when they move from Calcutta to Cambridge, initially, they find the city life quite okay. And then when they move to the suburbs, that's when Ashima feels more disintegrated in those spaces, actually, the move to the suburbs. But then when she goes back to the city on a visit, she again feels discomforted by that. So here we see how, this whole thing about space and place keeps playing. So it's not just about a kind of culture shock, it's also about a kind of spatial shock that comes up in these writings, right? So that is one thing. So now another text, which may not really come under the canonical Asian American writings, but one called The Transplanted Man by Sanjay Nigam. Here we find an ethnic enclave, a full-fledged ethnic enclave, that is a Little India enclave that is represented here. And Little India enclave has so many things like the Raju's Pan Shop, then places selling dosas and uttappams and kulfi and all those things. So, and here it is described, you find what is actually, you can listen to the Hindi songs there, then you can get the smell there. So it's like, how you actually enjoy a place with all your senses. It's not just the visual sense, which is actually pleased, but all your, the auditory and olfactory and all the senses. And then, but then he says that the only thing that was missing in that Little India enclave was an auto rickshaw, and with its exhaust and fumes that you find in all Indian cities, right? So, but then that shows for all, accounts for all the differences. So how much ever you create an certainly some sort of an inconsistency in the original and the recreated space. So that is the idea. All right. So so then another thing that you can find in these these writings is, if you're looking at an unskilled labor migrant like and who goes illegally to America, like in Inheritance of Loss, Biju the cook's son. He says it's from New York, when he's just confined to the basement kitchens of New York, and from there it's when he goes back to his hometown of Kalimpong that he actually finds there is a kind of vastness of spaces he can find. So while all these people as skilled immigrants were talking about the beauty of New York, or even if there are like certain issues with that, you're talking about the positive parts, about the positive effects of these spaces, then you find that in a person like Biju, he has never been able to really enjoy the space. So, for instance, I'll just close with my presentation with this. Biju hadn't seen such vastness in a long time. The sheer overwhelming enormity of mountainside and sea coming down the flank of it. So this is about Kalimpong, right? So yeah. So then I'm just closing my presentation here. I couldn't read out that from that poem. So that was a very quick presentation. I hope you could make something out of it. Thank you so much, all of you.
Thank you very much. That was a very interesting paper, and I really appreciated all the references to the Southeast Asian writers. Thank you very much. Now we're gonna have Ayla Raiter from Dev Samaj College for Women in Punjab University, who's going to speak about the search for identity in the works of Chitra Banerjee Divakaruni, with special reference to Palace of Illusions and the Forest of Enchantments. Thank you.
Thank you, Gabriela, and good morning, everyone. And I'll be presenting this paper on search for identity in the works of Chitra Banerjee Divakaruni, with special reference to the Palace of Illusions and the Forest of Enchantments. And Gopika has already given us an introduction about this. She's introduced Asian American writing. And among these writers, there we have writers like Bharti Mukherjee, Jhumpa Lahiri, and Divakaruni, who emerged as voices for predicament of Indian women struggling to maintain identity while surrendering to the process of assimilation. The women who were the marginalized within the marginalized. And while presenting the dilemmas of humans who constantly felt the pangs of cultural uprootedness and social alienation, Divakaruni draws her strength from her cultural heritage. Divakaruni's works initially centered around the immigrant experience of diasporic dislocations, the in-betweenness. In her short story collections, Arranged Marriage, and her novels ranging from Mistress of Spices to Sisters of My Heart to Queen of Dreams, time and again she has presented women in different situations, dealing with numerous struggles in the quest for identity, the attempt to define themselves. The tremendous response inspired Divakaruni to explore further the mind of a woman, her social positioning, and the gender construct in the Palace and the Forest of Enchantments. It is the writer's deep-seated desire to tell her story rather than his story that makes her reorient the epics. In the tradition of epics, both the epics are tales of valor. They are the Mahabharata and the Ramayana, of bravery and chivalry of battles fought. And the boasting of a number of strong women characters, they center around men and their tales. Divakaruni tells these stories through the eyes of the female protagonist, and she firmly believes that the narrator changes the tale. And Vyasa's Mahabharata essentially is the story of the Kuru clan, woven around myth, history, religion, science, philosophy, superstition, and statecraft. And it has these innumerable stories within stories to create a rich and teeming world with psychological complexity. Divakaruni felt that the epic had a number of powerful and complex women characters, like Kunti, the widowed mother of the Pandavas. Kunti, who is ready to even renounce heavens for the sake of her sons. And then we have got Gandhari, the devoted wife of the blind king, and Draupadi. Still, these women remained shadowy figures, and their roles ultimately remained subservient to their fathers or husbands, brothers or sons. The writer fulfills her wish to put a woman at the center. It is through Draupadi's eyes that we enter the innermost realms of her mind as we enter her palace of illusions. Like women anywhere in the world, Draupadi, born out of a sacrificial fire, is filled with a longing for her own space, a space that could fill her void, that could fulfill her desire for belongingness. Now here, the moment of her birth is very important. Right at the moment of her birth, she can sense her father's rejection because her father has organized this yagna in the hope of getting a male heir to avenge himself. And he's not expecting a daughter. And he doesn't even want to hold her because he just wants to hold the male child and proclaim to the world that the heir is here. But the Dri, her brother, doesn't leave her hand. He holds on to it. And Divakaruni seems to suggest that Dri has not been corrupted by the patriarchal mindsets. And this rejection is, she can sense this rejection, Draupadi. And while her brother is named Drishtadyuman, the destroyer of enemies, the girl is prophesied, the girl who has been prophesied to change the world is given the name Draupadi, the daughter of Drupad. She resents her father and his palace so much so that it never becomes her home. And she continues to long for one which she is sure that she will be completely different from the palace of her father. And she is very happy. She identifies herself so much with the place that she's very happy when Vyasa gives her the name Panchali, the spirit of Panchal. So again, we are aware of the circumstances in which Draupadi got married and her marriage to the five heroes of that time. But she is very angry at the manner in which her father and her prospective husband Yudhishthir, they debate over her fate without any thought for her will. And this anger simply melts away as Draupadi is warmly welcomed by Bhishma. Bhishma, again, here he's the enemy. He's the man her brother Shikhandi is supposed to be born to have been born to kill. And this man, she feels so happy when he welcomes her with the words, "I welcome you with all my heart to your new home." Because she's seeking a place to identify herself with, that this kindles a ray of hope in her heart, and she thinks that she may finally have found her space. So rather than her relations, Draupadi searches for her space, her home, and feels that her identity is linked with her home. But these moments remain short-lived and illusory as her palace of illusions at Indraprastha. As Draupadi finds herself shamelessly pawned at game of dice, we know her fate. And as she says at the end of the novel, half of her died the day when everyone she had loved and counted on to save her sat without protest and watched her being shamed. The other half perished with her beloved home. Neither her male relations nor her palace, her home, could give her an identity that could help her survive. It is her courage, her defiance, her steadfast commitment to her goal, her vengeance that helps her to sustain and define herself. From the initial works to the Forest of Enchantments, Divakaruni seems to be searching for answers to the challenges faced by women in the male-dominated world. The challenge to assert a woman's identity without upsetting the social fabric. In Forest of Enchantment, strangely, she seems to have found her answer. So Ramayana, as we know, we have Sita as the ideal of endurance. But Sita as the ideal of endurance and complete devotion to her husband and acceptance of his dictates has become synonymous with weakness, with meekness. The modern day interpretation of Ramayana has time and again rejected the wisdom of Ram, and the story has become symbolic of marginalization of women in a patriarchal structure promoted by the Brahminical ideology. It was seen as a tool to completely undermine the female while celebrating the male heroism. Divakarani here has, it seems to have struck the balance as she shows that to care for Sita, the reader need not end up hating Ram. So even Ram is not the other here. So the Sitayan reclaims the identity of Sita, who could not only speak out her desires and become aware of the mistakes she makes due to her impassioned outbursts and cravings, and can stand up to not just her husband, but also the Maharshi, is also capable of acknowledging Ram's courage, his devotion to his ideals, his generosity, his overwhelming love for her that must suffer a heartbreak due to his sense of duty, his vulnerabilities and his heroism, and even able to forgive him, as well as the Maharshi's wisdom, as Valmiki tells her, "You must write that story yourself, Ma, for only you know it." Valmiki here seems to reiterate Divakaruni's that Sita has to tell her story. In Draupadi and Sita, Divakaruni has not just found the modes to express the angst of women who have to time and again create a space for themselves, strive to make their voices heard, and reclaim their identity as they refuse to be relegated to being the marginalized other. She has also laid bare a woman's mind, her exhilaration and despair, quote, the heartbreak at the core of her joys, her unexpected alliances and desires, her negotiations, where in the hope of keeping one treasure safe, she must give up another, unquote. Both her female protagonists emerge triumphant as women of courage, the courage not just of speaking their mind, but also making choices, courage of endurance, of moving forward in spite of obstacles, of of never giving in. Thank you. I hope I have stuck to time.
Perfect timing. You finished like a few seconds before. Thank you very much. That was a fascinating paper. Now I want to read this work. So that was great.
A compliment, Gabriela.
I love a lot of Indian novels, and now I'm watching Indian series because I'm trying to learn Hindi. So now we're gonna hear Kavita Dhrilon, who is at the Department of English of Central University of Punjab, and her paper is reading John Oliver's Killen's CPS as a site of witness to the human rights violations of African Americans.
Yes, ma'am. Good morning, everyone. And good morning, Professor Gabriela. And thank you so much for introducing me and welcoming me. Thank you, ma'am. Okay, so now coming back to the paper. The title of my paper is Reading John Oliver Killen's City as a Site of Witness to the Human Rights Violations of African Americans. So John Oliver Killens, who is an African American author and activist who considered literature as a social function and not a private therapeutic. He also believed that, I quote, in the great drama unfolding before us, America is the stage, human rights is the universal theme, the Negro people are the protagonists, the audience is the entire world, unquote. So this paper makes an attempt to look at Killen's novel Sippy to understand the ways in which Killens depicted the civil rights movement and also to throw light on the human rights violations faced by African Americans during the 1960s and 1950s and 60s in the Wakefield County, Mississippi. And this narrative of the past stands relevant even in the present times, as how the deaths of Black men in the past few months, and particularly of George Floyd, uh, has stimulated the Black Lives Matter protest back into action against police brutality and unfair justice system. So years later, African Americans are still dealing with the same thing to end the state-sanctioned racial violence and racial discrimination. Killens in the novel Sippy depicts how African Americans are still being shot, killed, burned, exploited, bombed, and lynched. And as Sophia McLennan and Joseph Slaughter claim that, I quote, there is always a gap between the imagination of human rights and the state of their practice, unquote. And this gap is very much visible in the novel because when African Americans protest and fight for their rights and dignity in the county during the movement, whites try to stop them by adopting violent means to limit and regulate their resistance. And throughout the novel, Gillens demonstrates how the law and order, police, and other governing agencies of the state take no action against the white perpetrators. So, beginning with the depiction of the violation of the right to human treatment and right to life, liberty, and personal security of African Americans in the novel, Killens portrays that the life of African Americans is full of hardships and racial indignities. He illustrates different incidents of structural violence and inhuman treatment which happens in the novel. For instance, Chuck Othello Chane, the protagonist of the novel, two of his brothers gets killed when they defend themselves against the assault and violence by white men. So they become victims of physical and psychological brutalities of fights. And Sippy reveals that African Americans have no right to defend themselves against any assault, and they can always expect their rights and dignity to be denied. Thus, Killens shows us that the law is unfair and disregards the safety and well-being of African Americans, which in fact further violates their right to equality before the law and equal protection of the law. The law enforcement officials and courts stand silent and always protect the perpetrators of violence. As I quote, the white offenders have consistently lower probabilities of arrest as compared to the other minorities like African Americans, unquote, because no fair and impartial investigation is made into their perpetration, and as a result, the law of the land loses its credibility. Apart from portraying the way African Americans face the fear of death by whites, Killens in Sippy also depicts how African Americans in the county are constantly stigmatized as barbaric, wild, and uncivilized. Killen suggests that African Americans have been viewed as the single most threat to the white females in America, and they are the soft targets of any crime which happens with the whites, and particularly with white women. Whereas white males getting punished for sexually assaulting the black woman is a rare thing in America. And regarding this, Carlyle Van Thompson also writes, I quote, as historical documents reveal that white males were rarely, if ever, punished for any sexual violence or sexual misconduct when it came to an African American female. And in addition to it, Killens also highlights how African Americans were always discouraged and stopped from getting education or going to school, colleges, or universities. Killen suggests that right to education of African Americans is not a matter of concern for the state. The biased education system of the country illustrates how unfairly African Americans are being treated. The novel suggests that whites want to see the black minds enslaved and intellectually castrated. Killens depicts in the novel that that whites do not want to see blacks possess anything of their own, through which Killens further highlights the violation of the right to property. He shows that African Americans have lived in constant denial and they are in possession of almost nothing and they have no economic and social autonomy. I quote, I think of essential goodness of our people, our black people, how much they have given to this country and how this country has repaid them with denial and alienation, unquote. So this disownedness highlights that even after living in America for so many years and giving so much to this land, all the blood and sweat, whites still consider African Americans as the other. And this otherness is the result of the discursive acts of cultural framing, which invokes killing and rivalries. And as a result, they still face existential crisis as they are always kept bereft of owing anything, be it a home, a piece of land, which creates a sense of loss in them. And consequently, this limbo of disownedness creates a lack of belongingness in them. It is with such a realization that the protagonist, Chuck Othello Cheney, writes an essay in school, and his essay indicates the existential movements and situations in the life of African Americans who are always made to feel the outcast. In addition, Killens in the novel depicts how the so-called democratic system of America also violates the right of African Americans to vote and participate in the government. The powerful whites like Charles Wakefield never want the inclusion and participation of African Americans in administrative or governing responsibilities. They are against increasing the voter participation and political representation of African Americans because that will pose a competition and a direct threat to the white controlled political and economic system. Killens also indicates that the whites are against the right of African Americans to vote and participate in the government because they want to exploit and subjugate blacks, and they are power hungry. As the novel says, I quote, "The white man is scared of us voting because he wants our sweat and muscle for $2 a day. He wants us to work from king to king, but if we register and vote, we can run that kind of white man out of power." Unquote. So Killers through this novel suggests that whites are scared of losing their powers and controls over African Americans, and that is why they cannot see them participating in the civil rights movement and fighting for their rights. So this illustrates that white men can lose everything except for power. The rights of African Americans will always be cut back when they will clash with the interest of the powerful whites. As Killen says that the white man would sell his own mother down to the river to get power. The white man would give you everything but power. He would concede to you his darling daughter. So Killens in Sippy reveals the discomfort of whites during the voter registration drives to make the reader get the feeling that so far whites have never been fully ready to share any powerful positions with African Americans in the county as well as in the country. So coming to the conclusion, thus through all the above mentioned incidents, and I have skipped some of them, Killens highlights how during the late 1960s, the rights and dignity of African Americans frequently get violated by whites. The Black author systematically delineates in the novel that the social, economic, and cultural rights of African Americans are being constantly violated as they are bereft of getting an education, a work, or even owning anything of their own. Along with this, Killens demonstrates that the civil and political rights of African Americans are also violated by whites as the blacks are discouraged to get their right to vote and to participate in the government related activities by threatening them and by perpetuating all kinds of violence like lynching, shooting, bombing, and burning their houses. African Americans' right to equality before the law is also not protected by the state, as the novel depicts that the police and other governing and welfare agencies do not bother about their safety and security, as they are all controlled and governed by whites. The novel also suggests that the authorities fail to charge or arrest anyone because the law operates only to denounce uh, African Americans and other minorities, and in his own way records it in fiction to demonstrate to the posterity that there has always been a gap between the theory and practice of human rights in America. Therefore, the novel City makes the reader feel the condition of a category of people whose basic human rights have been denied, and makes us ponder the question as to whether the human rights indeed belong to all human beings, or does it belong only to those who are socially, culturally, economically, and politically positioned like whites in America. That's all. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Perfect. Fascinating paper too. I think that has a lot of connections to whatever is happening today.
Yes, ma'am.
We see that, you know. So now we're gonna have, thank you very much. That was really nice. Now we're gonna have Pratiksha Shivara from the Department of English and CLS in Saurashtra University. And she's gonna talk about the reappraisal of Harlem Renaissance a century later. Thank you.
Am I audible?
Yes.
Thank you so much, Gabriel ma'am. And good afternoon all. As ma'am has mentioned, my paper titled as The Reappraisal of Harlem Renaissance a Century Later. I would like to begin my paper with the words of Langston Hughes. I quote, "It was the period when the Negro was in fog," I unquote. And that was the reality happened in the Harlem later in the century. Harlem Renaissance, as one flowering of the new Negro movement, commenced with the Great Migration of the early 20th century. In true terms, Harlem Renaissance considered as an overt racial pride that represented in the idea of the Black people who, through intellect and production of literature, art, and music, challenges the pervading racism. The creation of art and literature sought to uplift the race. It included a wide variety of cultural elements and styles, including Pan-African perspective, high culture, and low culture or low life, from traditional music form of to the blues and jazz. Some common themes represented during the Harlem were the influence of the experience of slavery and emerging African folk tradition on Black identity, the effects of institutional racism, the dilemmas inherent in the tradition on, inherent in performing and writing for the elite audience, and the question of how to convey the experience of modern Black life in the urban North. It led many opportunities for Blacks to publish by mainstream publishers. Many authors began to publish novels, magazines, and newspapers during this time. There were many authors who became nationally known, such as Claude Mackay, Zora Neale Hurston, Alan Locke, Count Cullen, Langston Hughes, and many more. Among them, Langston Hughes, the pioneering figure of Harlem Renaissance and a true artist, drawn his art not from life, not from book, but from life. And he would not force to fit life to any of the readily available mold. His approach to poetry was far too simple and unlearned. He aimed to create a body of work that symbolized the beauty and variety of the African American and the American experiences, as well as the diversity of emotions, thoughts, and dreams. Although Hughes published works in wide variety of forms, so say for example, short stories, novels, autobiographies, plays, histories, essays, but he showed himself first and foremost as a poet. Before the publication of his first collection, The Weighty Blues, in 1926, he published several of his poems as an undergraduate student in the leading New Negro and mainstream magazines, including Crisis, Opportunity, and Survey Graphic. His volume marked a defining shift in New Negro poetics and larger artistic stance relative to the vernacular and folk culture. In his poem, Negro, he verbalized the experience and expression of black and included the brutal reality of they have faced in South. I would like to recite the poem, this plaque, as it is too commendable while he is presented the real situation they have faced in the South. I am a Negro, black as the night is black. Black life, the depths of my Africa. I have been a slave. Caesar told me to keep his doorsteps clean. I brushed the boots of Washington. I have been a worker. Under my hand, the pyramids arose. I made mortar for the Wordsworth building. I have been a singer. All the way from Africa to Georgia, I carried my sorrow songs. I made ragtime. I have been a victim. The Belgians cut off my hands in the Congo. The lynch me still in Mississippi. I am a Negro, black as the night is black. Black life like depths of my Africa. Here he has presented all the brutality they have faced in the South, and thus it became one of the reasons of the Great Migration. He took, he took up not only folk culture as the subject matter, but the same forms of expression that defined and sustained it. His attention to African American music, for example, jazz and blues in particular, as folk expression and poetic forms, stands as his most important poetic innovation. For instance, in Trans African, he used vernacular and the jazz music to symbolize the Black expression. In his second anthology, Fine Clothes to the Jew, he created blues poetry to explore more widely its artistic possibilities. Hughes, in his blues and jazz poems, wrote fundamentally a new kind of verse, one that told of the joys and sorrows, the trials and triumphs of ordinary Black folk and the language of that typical speech and composed out of a genuine love of his people. Arnold Ramsey regarded Hughes' poetry jazz poetry as one genuinely original achievement in form by any Black American poet. His poem Negro dances two presents a Black speaker celebrating his relationship in the idiom of jazz. Once, when he was asked what is poetry, he answered, I quote, it is the human soul, entire, squeezed like a lemon or a lime, drop by drop into atomic words. I unquote. He don't wanted to to give any definition of the poet that divorced his art from the immediacy of life, and thus he has declared, I quote, a poet is a human being, and each human being must live within his time, with and for his people, and within the boundaries of his country. He constantly called upon himself to write according to his beliefs. I end quote. As a result, if we look at to the contribution of Langston Hughes, what he has did for the blacks in African American continents, it is the same like we have witnessed with the Irish region, what Singe has did with the Irish literature. And if we look at to the contribution, this Langston Hughes investment in African American culture in vernacular and folk roots helped to set the stage for the most innovative and influential poetry of the new Negro era. The influence of Harlem in general and Langston Hughes in particular can be found in many further movements of the age like civil rights movements, Black arts movement, celebrating the manifesto of Renaissance. Black is beautiful. Thank you. I hope I have completed within time.
Absolutely. You even had like 1 minute left. Thank you very much. That was really very interesting.
Thank you.
Yes, thank you. These papers are all really good. And you guys are able to give them in 10 minutes. This is amazing. All right, so now we're gonna have Ruby Jindal. She looks green, but I think that's her computer's card. So Ruby Jindal is from the Akal Degree College in Mastwana.
Yes, good afternoon, ma'am. Good afternoon, everyone.
From Zangrur in Punjab.
Yes, yes,
And
Sangrur.
her paper is going to be Reconstructing Identities.
Identities, yes.
Black American Poets of Harlem Renaissance.
Yes. Good afternoon, everyone. Topic of my presentation is Reconstructing Identities, Black American Poets of Harlem Renaissance. American literature's 400-year history has been shaped by the rise of Black writers who have often written rich and vibrant literary forms to complement American literature and culture. The goal of this paper is to present how African American literature attempted to rebuild their identities during the Harlem Renaissance, primarily to end the negative stereotypes of Black people. This was an era of artistic achievement focused on the Harlem section of New York City by Black American writers, musicians, and artists. The Blacks in America continue to articulate their Black identity through poetry, as poetry is always considered to be the most condensed and compact genre of literature. African American poetry was basically born during Harlem Renaissance. Poets such as Langston Hughes, Claude McKay, Countee Cullen have been the most influential poets of this period, and their poetry has tried to articulate authentically the African American experience. Thus, the purpose is to discuss how these new groups of Black writers have taken a step forward to shift the deeply prejudicial images of Blacks. With the end of Civil War in 1865, thousands of newly liberated African Americans from the yoke of slavery in the South started to dream of great inclusion in the American society, including political empowerment and economic and cultural self-determination. The 1920s Harlem Renaissance, it was a movement which aimed at recreating a distinctive African American identity and exploring Black voices in the arts. To alter racial assumptions in the culture, Langston Hughes, Countee Cullen, Claude McKay, and other writers developed a new identity. They shared common experiences of slavery, liberation, and ethnic inequality in poetry. Most notably, the Harlem Renaissance instilled a new spirit of self-determination and pride, a new social consciousness, and a new dedication to political activism in African Americans across the world. Langston Hughes, the most accomplished poets of Harlem Renaissance, he made an indelible contribution to American literature. Through his poetry, he describes the frustration, bitterness, disappointment, and loneliness of Black persons. Hughes started to write poetry at the early age of 19, and he wrote his signature poem, The Negro Speaks of Rivers. Through the poems, Hughes asserts the continuity of ancient heritage, which cannot be destroyed by their forcible abduction and displacement to an alien land. His poetry is free from rigid implication and more restricted verse, as he uses free verse in his poems. Hughes speaks in a voice familiar to all Blacks to share his experiences with his own community. In one of his most famous poems, As I Grew Older, Hughes speaks eloquently for the oppressed and marginalized who had to suffer indignities in the United States on account of their being Black and poor. The speaker in the poem says that he had dreams, aspirations in his life, just as any other child. But as he grew older, all his dreams were shattered singly because he was a Black child. As he says in the poem, it was a long time ago, I have almost forgotten my dream. But it was there then in front of me, bright like a sun, my dream. And then the wall rose slowly, slowly, slowly between me and my dream. Thus, he says the color of his skin would always come in his way like a great wall. The poem, however, does not become a personal lament alone, as Hughes goes on to condemn all form of oppression, whether they are based on race, gender, nationality, or a religion. The poem ends on a rebellious note as the poet says that if the black people stand together and fight against racial discrimination, they can fulfill their dreams. The need of the hour, he proclaims, is to unite together and fight for their rights. He, like Walt Whitman, believes in the democratic America in the future where each person is treated on an equal level, irrespective of their race and color. Thus, the poet in the poem envisions a great future for blacks without any discrimination and injustice. Claude McKay is another greater exponent of Harlem Renaissance who migrated to New York in 1920s. He used his sonnets, he wrote sonnets titled as If We Must Die, The Lynching, Tiger, as a tool to awaken the oppressed and exploited race to have proud of their own culture and heritage. Unlike Hughes, whose poems developed love and respect for African culture and heritage, Mackay's poem was call to action. Through this poem, he encourages blacks not to submit before whites. He is urging them not to become weak like hunted and penned in an inglorious sport, but fight against those attacking them, while attacking may cause death. Means he urges them not to make their deaths noble. So thus the poet in the poem expresses the kind of new awareness, courage, and determination in blacks. The poem became amazingly popular and recited by all those who were oppressed and abused. As Mackay himself confirmed in his essay that he began to see himself as transformed into a medium to express a mass sentiment. Thus, the poem also became the inspiration for the civil rights activists in the 1960s. Count Cullen, he is another foremost figure of the Harlem Renaissance. Unlike Hughes, whose themes and subjects in poetry were always dealt with racism, lynching, and frustration of blacks, Cullen did not accept the idea that his poetry should always treat racial themes. In Yet Do I Marvel, one of Cullen's most famous sonnets, he addresses a dilemma of vacillating between playing aesthetic and racial spokesman. Thus, he wanted his poems not to be limited to the racial art, but to be evaluated on the basis of universal art, not only as a black poet. In this way, the poetry of 1920s was an expression of innermost experiences of poets, their desires, their yearnings, their fears and anxieties. It dealt with several themes such as racism, imperialism, hypocrisy, and other forms of social injustice. Stephen Henderson aptly describes 1920s poetry as the process of self-definition made clearer and sharper as the self-reliance and racial consciousness of an early period are revived and raised to the level of revolutionary thought. In this way, the poets of Harlem Renaissance wrote about injustice of racism and prejudice against them in such a beautiful and soulful renditions which touched every heart. These were the major poetic voices who brought Black poetry to new heights of competence and maturity. They laid the foundation for the militant and resistance Black poetry of 1960s. Thank you. Here end my presentation. Thank you.
That was really good. Thank you. Thank you, Ruby, very much.
Thank you, ma'am.
And it was very felt too. We all felt it. So now we're gonna have Shaminaz Baino from the Department of English of RTMM College in Allahabad, India, and is going to speak about the rise of diasporic American Muslim writers. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Gabriela, ma'am. A very good afternoon to everybody. I'm Dr. Shaminaz from Allahabad. So today I will be presenting a paper entitled as New Trend in American Literature, the Rise of Diasporic American Muslim Writer. When we look up to America, we see America as a country of extreme liberalism, individual freedom, choice, and existence, and modern and lavish way of living, which is a center of attraction of mostly people around the world. And the new rise of globalization and capitalization has also added to its glory, making a dream for people of the third world. So people from the other part of the world in search of better ways of living, education, and for monetary gain wish to settle there. But everything is not so easy as it is appear. And more or less, they have to face some problem in a new atmosphere. And the most important issue is adjustment, or we can say assimilation. The fact that some people find it difficult to adapt themselves to the new surrounding, which is different than the society of their native country. They experience cultural shock as American culture and society are very different from their traditional work. This is especially a vital issue for the Muslim community of Middle East or countries like Afghanistan when they migrate to United States. But in recent time, we have seen a rise of diasporic writers who are enriching the American literature by sharing their immigrant experience. There are many such writers, but I'm focusing on some writers like Moja Khaf, Khalid Hussaini, Susan Abul Hawa, Asra Nomani, and Samina Ali. So uh, the language widely spoken in America is English. So the literature of this country is basically in English. There are many famous writers belonging to America like Arthur Miller, Henry James, James Joyce, Virginia Woolf, Mark Twain. And yesterday we have seen American Nobel Prize winner Louis Gluck. So, this link is further expanded into Asian American writer, Afro-American, the famous Nobel Prize winner like Toni Morrison, Maya Angelou, and others such. So, all this literature makes America a multicultural literature, and and people of different countries, when they go and settle in America, they make it a multicultural society. People from other parts of the world migrate to America in a large scale due to various reasons. They have various dreams and aspirations, but not every time their dreams are fulfilled, or it takes half of their lifetime. As one of the scholar has discussed about Muhsin Hamid, the reluctant fundamentalist. In that also we see that the protagonist Changiz, he has American dream. He goes to study there. He gains education, then he also acquires a good position in over there. But when 9/11 happened, many things changes. So this has happened to many people, and when a person living in an alien land and he try to assimilate in that culture, then he or she faces major or minor problem in assimilating a culture which is totally different than their culture. Now, many people, for expressing their feeling, experience, and problem, have taken the help of literature. Since literature is the only medium of expression of a personal experience, there has been an abundance of diasporic literature in the past few years who want to share their views and experience with people of the world. As Paul Brand speaks, I quote, indeed, post-colonial writers often move to England or North America because they have been exiled or because they find a more receptive audience there, or simply in search of a more comfortable mode of living. And even sometimes, like Soinka calls upon the government of these neo-colonialist nations to the aid of freedom movement, seeking to overthrow native talent. So we see many exile writers also going to America for better career option, or for freedom of speech. So these writers are many writers, not all writers, many writers are not able to detach their mind from the land from which they belong. There is nostalgia in these writers that colors their work. There is also a concern for homeland, uh, uh, which they have left behind, or which maybe they will not be able to go back. Some terms that are usually associated with diaspora are like exile, alienation, nostalgia, despair, dislocation, abandonment, and disintegration. Now, Muslim also constitute a major part of American population. And they also have developed a literature known as Muslim American literature, which though is derived by many people, but Moja Khaf, which is a Syrian American writer, she argues and she says that there is a term known as Muslim American literature, for which this she elaborates her point by saying that, I quote, it begins with the Muslims of the Black Art movement. The autobiography of Malcolm X is one of its iconic texts. It includes American Sufi writing, secular ethnic novel, writing by immigrant and second generation Muslims and religious American Muslim. Many of the work I would put forth in this category are such as African American, Arab American, and South Asian literature, the third world women's writing, diasporic Muslim English, and so forth. She believes that the place of these work in other category cannot be denied, and when you read them, you will gain something together as part of an American Muslim cultural landscape. She compares American Muslim literature with the Jewish American literature of 1930. But this is a formative stage for the Muslim American literature. Now, Moja Kaf, who is a Syrian-born American writer, poet, and author, currently works as an associate professor of comparative literature in Al-Kansas, USA. Some of her famous work include the Western representation of Muslim women from Terma Crane to Odalits, 1999, Email from Scheherazade, which is a poetry anthology she published in 2003, and The Girl in the Tanger and Sap, a novel which she published in 2006. Her book, Western Representation of Muslim Women, is highly praised by the scholar around the work for the depiction of Muslim women. And not only Moja Kaf, but we see there are many other writers who have made America their new dwelling place due to a reason like civil war or many other issues. In this, we can include Khalid Hosseini, who Afghani-born writer, but because of civil war has gone to America. Then there are other writers like Susan Abul Hawa, Palestinian American writer, then Indian American writer like Asra Nomani and Sabina Ali. These writers have gained name and fame and are famous around the world. Maybe one of the reasons is that they have been writing in America. So Khalid Hosseini is a fiction writer who is famous for his masterpiece, The Kite Runner, and the Thousand Splendid Sun. So the novel Kite Runner is very much similar with the life of Khalid Hosseini himself. If we read the novel, we'll find that it's somewhat autobiographical novel in which Khalid Hosseini is talking about civil war of Afghanistan and many major issues vital for Afghanistan. So the novel Kite Runner shows the lifelong guilt consciousness of protagonist Amir and the way by which he able to redeem himself from it. So it is a way, it is a glory of guilt and redemption. There are two main characters in this novel, Amir and Hazara. So this novel also portrays the century-old rift between Shias and Sunni, which is existing in Afghanistan, Pakistan, and some other country. So throughout the novel, he has shown this ethnic rivalry between Pashtun and Hazara. Now, Pashtun are Sunnis and Hazara are Shia. Pashtun community, which consider themselves as a high class, is totally dominant in the country. And the Hazara, they consider Hazara as a low class. So we see, but he has shown how Taliban has done destruction in Afghanistan. But at the same point, living in America, he has not shown any darker side of America, like how America was involved in the Afghani war of independence, or how they supported Taliban in the beginning, and how they have turned their back once Taliban were against them. So there are other writers like Susan Abul Hawa, who is a Palestinian American author. She has to leave Palestine due to educational purpose. She went to America, she settled there, and she wrote some famous novel like Morning in Jennings and The Blue Between the Sky and River. So, and we have Asra Nomani and Samina Ali, who are Indian and living in America. Okay, this one point. So it is a commonplace of modernism that exiled writers or immigrant writer benefit from his or her uprooting, and that what is left behind is seen more clearly from a distance, while the new abode is seen in a sharper focus than it is indigenous and managed. Thank you so much. Thank you, ma'am. Thank you so much.
Sorry about that, but if we don't do it, then we won't have the time for the discussion. And I think that these are really good papers. Like Manju said, we should expect very good papers. I appreciate all of these papers. And it's very interesting to me that they all take place in the United States and not elsewhere in the Americas. That is also interesting because there's so much Indian literature, you know, coming from the Caribbean, coming from other places. And now there's a big group in Mexico, you know, of scholars from India. So it's interesting to me that you guys are all writing about the United States and not even Canada or, you know, or the Caribbean. So I think we have some time.
Gabby, you got muted.
All right. Somehow I got muted. Yeah, I was saying here is 2 o'clock in the morning. So I don't really know what time it is in India and how long we have.
Oh, we have about 20 minutes, 25 minutes for discussion.
Perfect.
Yeah.
So anybody has a question, a comment?
I'm sure there will be some points for discussion because they're all very enthusiastic about their presentations.
Yeah, they were great papers.
Yeah, and they had to keep time, and so they rushed through their papers. I'm sure that some points of discussion have been left out, which can be taken up now. Come on, Ela, let's begin with you. We can't hear you. A little louder, please. A little louder. Adjust the audio of your laptop.
But I have a question if nobody wants to speak. How do you guys see all this Harlem Renaissance comparing to what is happening today? I mean, as we were discussing in the previous session, we're having major problems in the United States because people are being shot for being Black, for being different. So how do you guys see that this literature gives us light, you know, on the present moment?
I think it's a question that we all need to ponder upon. Why is it that we cannot be tolerant of people who are different from us, whether in appearance or in lifestyle or in beliefs? That's a question that has come up in some of the presentations just now. I can see that Professor Ahmed has joined us. Professor Ahmed is from Bangladesh. Hi, Ahmed, would you like to contribute to the discussion? Would you like to raise a point? We are talking about how we look at the other. How do we look at the other?
Thank you, Professor Munju. I have been here since morning, but I just kept my camera off because this is yesterday we kicked off.
That's right.
Well, it's been interesting.
Sorry, there was something wrong with my audio. I hope you can hear me now. Could I have the question again, please?
We are just taking Dr. Ahmed's point of view. We'll come back to you, Ila. Ahmed.
Okay, so it's been quite an interesting session because we were talking about equality. We have been talking about respect from respect among different communities, etc. But as Gabriela has noted and you chipped in that why we can't be tolerant these days, why you have become so hostile over the years. So I mean, this is something which we need to think and also penetrate into, because it should have been different. Of course it should have been different, but it has gone absolutely in the other way. We don't have this kind of friendship which is supposed to have between or amongst neighbors. It's not there. Something definitely has gone somewhere, and we need to have kind of a soul search. That is, we need to begin kind of a soul search so that we understand where we have gone wrong. And we need to begin with ourselves. We need to ask ourselves what we have done wrong. So that's my, position to your question, Manju.
Thank you.
I think
Professor Reiter?
no.
Professor Reiter? Yeah.
Ela Rathor. Her name is Ela Rathor. Yes, Ela?
Yeah. So what Professor just mentioned, that yes, everywhere we see that there is more conflict, and like I feel that this is so because as I studied the post-colonial literature or feminist writings or the very feminist interpretation of the epics, I've realized over the years, I think all of us who have studied these have realized that in the quest for identity, in the quest to establish yourself, to bring yourself to the center, any kind of marginalized community, whether it is women or it can be because of a caste or a religion, or you are in a different country, you are the minority there, any kind of minority or marginalized self, when it tries to put itself in the center, it is othering the other. The other is still there. So when the other is still there, the conflict continues. That is what I mentioned in my paper, and what we find, especially in Forest of Enchantments, because for decades now we have heard how people have, in the modern interpretation, has completely, rejected the persona of Ram. So in trying to bring Sita to the foreground, they relegate Ram a very inferior position, and they not just an inferior position, they are not ready to give the male also that there is not it's not about equality, it is about putting one over before the other. So there Divakaruni, what she has done, she has specifically in her preface, she mentions there that I want that when you side with one, you don't hate the other. So I think that is important. And because now in past few decades, almost half a century, the marginalized have had the voices. That is very important, that okay, while giving the voice to the woman, it is important that we speak about gender, we don't speak about feminism, because that's where even the feminist movement gets harmed instead of benefiting. I believe so.
Thank you. Anybody else wants to chime in?
Sakshi wants to say something. Sakshi, please.
Hello. Hello. Yes. So I'm just responding to Ela ma'am's articulation about identity. Um, I understand that when we're talking about identity formation, it is a very complex idea. And obviously, when you are forming an identity, you will start othering some other identities. However, I also see it as a bit problematic that when the so-called subalterns speak, the dominant, they always feel threatened by their representation. So it is not always a positive representation. So in the context of Ram and Sita, I come from a community which does not consider Ram as an ideal son-in-law, right? I mean, people would rather marry another god than Ram because he betrayed our queen, the queen of Mithila. And there are local folklores who are just berating Ram for his cowardliness. There are temples which don't even have the statue of Ram, right? So I feel that if women or if community is expressing their anger, they are speaking up against, it's always the dominant who will feel threatened, right? So we should talk about equality from the perspective of, yes, when we make like sweeping statements like now the marginalized have voices, oh my God, let's not talk about these things. We should also represent that not always you will have a positive representation of your oppressors. And even if allowing that voice to come out, lash out in anger, we should give that space. So it's not othering, it is speaking out. So we should differentiate between othering and speaking out. and most people, they feel that it's one and the same thing. So that's my view on that.
So, Sakshi, I totally agree with what you have said, that we need to give them the space to speak out. And unless we give them the space to speak out, we cannot hope for any kind of change. So, when I said that by othering the other, we are continuing with the conflict, I was answering what Professor Dr. I think Dr. Ahmed, I couldn't get the name and it's not visible there. So, when he said that, why is it so that even after years of all this, the conflict is more? There is more of exclusion than inclusion. So why is it happening? And it is because if instead of looking at gender and giving space to not just both the genders but all different kinds of gender constructs, we just want to put one at the center, that's when conflict happens. And when we are talking about gender, we take it to other such dichotomies, then or binaries, then I think that's why I answered that because it is, we always think in the terms of self and the other. So as inclusiveness and inclusion, we are now talking about inclusion and inclusiveness more, whether it's in terms of racism or
I think we
communalism.
lost you, Professor Rather.
Yeah, but I can hear her
Um,
pretty well, huh?
we
So
can't hear you now.
I can hear her.
So whether it is
Hello, Manja, can you
caste or any kind of binaries we look at or dichotomies there in the society, then I think we are moving towards the thought that we need more of inclusiveness. That's
I
what
also
my
want to say it's political though. If the people at the top promote hatred, it's very likely that you're gonna have more hatred because they put up the stakes for it. And if people on top, they say, okay, we're going to be inclusive, and they put policies in place, we can go towards a different society. And I think that we are at a point in time where many governments in the world, unfortunately, are promoting hatred among people, and this is causing all kinds of problems.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. And sometimes the policies say something, but in practice there is something else. So there's a difference between what is said and what is done. But we cannot really do much about what the laws of the government are. What we can do is we can set our own little sphere in order. The change should begin with us. So we are the change, and at least in our day-to-day lives, in our circles, in the people, among the people who are close to us, if we start that way, then I think there is a little hope for mankind. So tolerance is something that is not just to be preached, but it is to be practiced. And it is to be practiced at the individual level, then at the family level, then at the community level, and that's how we go on until it becomes a culture.
There was a big
just
philosophy
can I
school, the
have 2 minutes?
Budapest school.
What Gabriela ma'am, she just mentioned that it has to start from the top. And what Professor Jessica said, that we have to do it. I think we have to take the initiative more, because top means the power centers, and power centers survive on, the biases and dividing the societies rather than on having an inclusive society. They won't survive. The power struggle is all about the self and the other.
Divide and
And
win,
one
divide
thing,
and win.
Professor Jedka, if you permit me, I can just share an anecdote. Way back 15 years back, some information,
There's a
and
problem.
that was a Karwa Chaude.
There's a problem with your audio, Ela.
Can you hear me now? Yeah. So this was a slightly personal anecdote, and Professor Jetka, I hope you will pardon me if I go wrong somewhere. That many years back, 15 years back or so, I called you up for some information, and that was a Karwa Chauth day. And you asked me, are you fasting? I said yes. And you asked me, is your husband fasting? Both of you should fast, because both of us are fasting. And there was a very different dimension, because this is many, many years back, when this was not still not talked about. And it happened. I still remember that.
Yeah, you see, why should you starve for the sake of your spouse's life and he should have his fill? Yeah, why should it be like that? Huh?
And so it begins right in the family, where the daughter should feel, especially, and even the sons, that the gender bias is not there.
I don't understand the context, but that's okay.
Gabby, I'll have to explain to you. We have a lot of rituals, you know, which are very male centered. So we'll talk about it another time.
Hello.
All right, thank you.
So I guess Bhamna wants to say something. He has raised her hand.
Yeah. I was just wondering how in this conference it has been made possible that a conference called 400 Years of American Literature, we have crossed across all topographical distinctions and talking about Mahabharata and Ramayana. I think that is a great achievement in itself. I was just wondering, Ila ma'am, whether you have watched Grant Morrison's 18 Days and also Sita Sings the Blues, which are animated Western versions of our own culture. These are very important and very interesting to look at, because Sita Sings the Blues is a very short animated film before Sita commits her suicide. I would not term it anything
You know
else
what?
because that is what it was.
You know what? We've had a lot of conversation on this particular angle. So if some of the other speakers would like to take this up, it's fine. If Kavita wants to answer something, it's fine. But
Ma'am.
otherwise, let's move on to other aspects of this particular session.
Hello, ma'am. Ma'am, I want to ask something if I can.
Please go
Hello?
ahead and don't sound so timid.
No. Okay, so I want to ask Professor Gabriel or Professor Manju or anyone who can, like, who would like to give some insights about representation of human rights violations of African Americans in literature. And I also want to know, like, how to study or read human rights theory and human rights literature, which are, I mean, still new as compared to the traditional theories like feminism or psychoanalysis or
So
post-colonialism.
maybe Kavita and Ruby would be the right people to talk about it. But tomorrow we are having a session. We are having a session which is going to be chaired by Professor Amritjeet Singh, who's a leading scholar on African American literature. So we'll have some discussion then also. But today, perhaps the speakers here, um, we've had some speakers. They might be interested in answering this question. Sorry, Gabby, I'm taking up your prerogative.
That's okay. I'm an anthropologist, so from my point of view, it's very different.
Hello.
We were talking about Kavita. Kavita, you have something to say about it?
No, ma'am, I
You're the
just
one who
wanted to ask. Yes,
you're the
yes,
one who
ma'am.
asked the question.
Yes, yes.
Ruby, you want to say?
Yes, ma'am, please repeat the question, please.
Kavita, quickly repeat the point that you want to
You
clarify.
want to know?
Okay, I want to know if you would like to give some insights about human rights violations of African Americans in literature. I mean, representation of their human rights violation, and like how to study or read theories which are, I mean, human rights theory, which is
Yes, there are so
still
many
new.
theories. Stuart Hall, one theory is of Stuart Hall, hybrid identities. We can read that theory and we can base our paper on that theory, hybrid identities, because African Americans, they have always faced hybrid identities, black and white. They have always written through the hybrid identities. As Langston Hughes, he is also describing this. He is also writing through these identities. And then after 1960s, in 1960, Amiri Baraka, he expounded his theories, and he explained that we should be totally different. He came with the violent poetry. I have researched, I have gone through the poems of Amiri Baraka, Maya Angelou, Nikki Giovanni, the 1960s civil rights activists. They were condemning the oppression. They were condemning violence, or they wanted to get separate African culture, African literature, which is not possible. But the Stuart Hall, he is talking about hybrid identities, that we should uh, we should mingle the black and white identities, because black white cannot be raised away. White is also a part of white culture, has also become a part of their culture. White
Pratiksha,
has
would you
also.
like to add to it? Pratiksha, because you also spoke about a similar subject. You talked about reappraisal of the Harlem Renaissance a century later.
Yes, ma'am. I just want to add, like as Kavita has said, that she wants to know about human rights and Afro-American
Your sound is not
culture.
clear. Pratiksha, your sound is not clear.
Hello, am I audible now, ma'am?
Now it's better.
Yeah. So I would like to just tell Kavita that if she wants to know about humanitarian aspect of in Afro-American culture, then first of all we have to understand the colonial aspect, that how that those people were colonized and how the brutality were just bad on them. So to know that this novel Heart of Darkness is one of the exemplary novel through which we can understand that how they were treated and how they were marginalized in their own land, and then we can go ahead towards to know about the mentality of this British Empire through the works of Edward Said's Orientalism. And there we have a glimpse of how we are portraying in the eyes of the whites through the works of this whites, and how the Occident and the Orient are represented. So I think to begin with, to know something about the humanitarian aspect of the blacks or the marginal races, we have to go through like this, and I suggest that only.
Thank you, ma'am.
Even this, yeah.
Thank you so much.
Ma'am, I want to.
Yeah, please speak now.
Ma'am, I want to ask one point that we have talked about lots of identities related literature in America, like African American literature. Then we have Chicano writer in America, Asian American writers, but we don't find much native voices in American literature, like we have in Australia, and we have in Canada. We have in Australia, we have Aboriginal writers like Sally Morgan. In Canada, we also have many native writers, even the writers like George Ryger, who is a English by birth, but he is writing about Native Americans. His Ecstasy of Rita Joy is a very fine example of this. But in America, this I have taught in MA, in my MA classes and in my graduation classes, Chicano poetry, African American poetry, Caribbean American poetry, Asian American poetry, but we don't find much native writers' voices. So ma'am, anybody, either Manju ma'am or you, please throw, or anybody else can throw light on Native American writers.
Gabby, may I take that one?
Oh, yeah. Sure. Go ahead.
Yes, you are very right that the Native American voice is not given too much of importance. And even in our conference, this conference that we are having, we got just, I think, one probably abstract on Native American writing. And I had to turn it down because of purely technical reasons. I realized this gap that we are facing with, but we are doing something about it. In fact, next Friday, coming Friday on the 16th of October, we are having the capstone conference, as you know, and in that capstone conference, there'll be a special lecture on Native American literature by Professor Brajesh Sani, who is an expert in the field. So hopefully that will take care of some of the issues that you have raised. And yes, you're very right. We need to be familiar with the Native American poets, the kind of work that they're doing, and what is their position in society now. So we are doing something about it.
Ma'am, can we attend that lecture? Ma'am, can we attend that lecture?
Of course. You are part of the conference, and that is the capstone. Huh? That is the capstone. So the link will be sent to all of you. And otherwise also it will be live streamed. So you can access it asynchronously also. Thank you, Gabby.
I just want to
Gabby,
say
you have 2
something.
minutes. You have 2 minutes to sum up and wind up.
All right. No, I just want to say something that one of my favorite poets is Joy Harjo. And she's a Native American poet. And please look her up because she's also
Is it
a musician. She
Harjo
plays
or
the
Hario?
sax.
Is it Harjo or Hario? I heard somebody pronouncing it Hario.
I don't know. She pronounces it Harjo, as far
Okay,
as
so it must be
I
Harjo.
know.
Yeah.
There's also Sherman Alexie, who is completely famous and has written a lot of books. There's a lot of Native American literature, and it's really good. However, there's something like what's happening to me right now with you guys is that you have to have some references to Native American mythology sometimes to understand what is happening in the novel. Exactly. I mean, a lot of you are speaking about Sita and all these things from the Mahabharata, I think, and I don't have these references.
Yeah.
Well, I have to say that this has been a really wonderful session, and thank you. And I'm honored that Manju invited me to chair it. And I'm sorry that my internet just disappeared. I mean, the electricity disappeared. We had a hurricane in the past 2 days here. And so our city is kind of, coming back to life. And we still have a lot of water outside. So thank you so much. And it's been a pleasure meeting you. I'm going to try to stay, but I don't know if I'm going to make it because now it's 2:30 in the morning here. Thank you, Manju.
Thank you so much, ma'am. Thank you so much. It's an honor for us that you chaired the session. It was really nice interacting with you. Thank you so much, all the presenters. Thank you, everyone. And now we are going to shift from the movements to the non-fiction section, which we are going to start sharp at 2 p.m. And for that, you have to log in at 1:50. So now, bye-bye for the time being. Have your lunch and see you at 1:50. Thank you so much. Bye-bye. Please, you have to leave the meeting because